Hey guys, tonight we're diving into something you've probably never thought about while watching those epic medieval battle movies. What the hell did knights actually eat when they were stuck in the middle of nowhere for months? Picture this: you're a fully armoured warrior in 1346, somewhere in the muddy fields of northern France. You've been marching for 3 weeks. Your horse smells like death. Your squire keeps complaining about blisters. And your stomach. Oh, your stomach is staging a full rebellion because the last decent meal you had was back when you could still remember what your wife's face looked like. No McDonald's, no supply drops, no refrigeration, just you, a couple thousand other hungry men, and the very real possibility that you'll starve before you even see combat. Now here's the thing that makes this fascinating. Knights didn't just show up to war and hope for the best. Medieval armies developed incredibly sophisticated and sometimes absolutely insane systems for keeping their soldiers fed. We're talking mobile bakeries, livestock herds that followed armies like confused parades and foraging rules that could mean the difference between a full belly and a hanging. Because here's what those movies never show you. More soldiers died from starvation and food-related diseases than from actual fighting. The chronicles are filled with accounts of armies that literally ate themselves into oblivion or fell apart because the bread ran out before the enemy even arrived. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I love seeing this community spread across time zones, all of us learning together in the quiet hours. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You need to understand something fundamental. A knight in campaign wasn't just a warrior. He was a walking logistics problem. Every day his body needed roughly 3,000 to 4,000 calories just to function, and that's before you factor in wearing 60 pounds of armour, riding a warhorse for 8 hours, and occasionally hacking people apart with a longsword. His horse needed even more, about 20 pounds of grain and 10 to 15 pounds of hay daily. Multiply that by an army of 10,000 men and their mounts, and you're looking at an almost incomprehensible supply challenge. We're talking hundreds of tons of food needed every single week, moving through territories that often couldn't feed their own populations. The fear of hunger haunted every commander. You can read it in their letters, in the careful calculations of medieval quartermasters who obsessed over grain counts like Wall Street traders watching stock tickers. Edward III of England once delayed an entire invasion of France because his supply ships got stuck in port. The Mongols conquered half the known world partly because they solved the food problem better than anyone else. Their riders could survive on horsemeat, fermented mare's milk, and sheer terrifying efficiency. But European knights, they needed bread, they needed ale, they needed the familiar tastes of home, or their morale would crack like thin ice. And here's where it gets interesting. The solution wasn't just about quantity, it was about preservation, transportation, and the dark art of making food last when everything in the natural world wanted it to rot. You're about to discover how medieval armies turned warfare into a strange combination of military campaign and travelling food festival, complete with all the chaos, ingenuity, and occasional cannibalism that implies. Yes, we'll get to that part. But first let's talk about what you actually packed when you knew you might not see a proper kitchen for 6 months. The psychology of it fascinates me. Imagine knowing that your survival depends not on your sword skill, but on whether the supply wagons make it through that forest, whether the river is low enough to ford without soaking the grain, whether the locals will sell you food or burn their own fields to spite you. Every knight marching to war carried this knowledge like a second sword, heavier, sharper, always at his back. You're standing in your castle courtyard on a grey morning in March, and your squire is packing your campaign supplies. This isn't like packing for a weekend trip. This is packing for potential months of survival in conditions that would make a modern survivalist weep. The leather satchels and saddlebags getting loaded onto your pack horses contain what military historians call campaign rations, but what you'd probably call barely edible desperation food. Let's look inside those bags and see what's actually coming with you to war. First item hardtack. If you've never encountered this medieval staple, imagine a cracker that could double as a weapon. These were thick, dense biscuits made from flour water and salt baked multiple times until they achieved the consistency of fossilized wood. A properly made hardtack biscuit could last for years without spoiling, which was exactly the point. The trade-off. You needed to soak it in ale, wine, or soup for several minutes before your teeth could even dent it. Soldiers famously called it molar breakers or tooth dullers, and knights often sucked on pieces for hours like the world's most disappointing hard candy. But here's the clever part. Each biscuit packed about 100 calories into a lightweight, indestructible package. You could drop one in mudfish it out a week later, rinse it off, and it was still perfectly edible. Well, edible might be generous, but it wouldn't kill you. Next to the hardtack, you've got salted meat, usually pork or beef, though sometimes mutton if you're a state-kept sheep. The preservation process was brutal. The meat got packed in layers of coarse salt so thick it looked like snowdrifts, then pressed under weights for weeks. What emerged was essentially meat-flavoured jerky with the texture of leather and enough sodium to make your kidneys file a formal complaint. You'd need to soak it in fresh water before cooking sometimes for a full day just to make it chewable. The salt content was so intense that chroniclers describe soldiers developing unquenchable thirst after eating it. But again it lasted. Properly salted meat could survive 6 months to a year, which meant the difference between eating protein and watching your muscles waste away. Then there's the dried peas and beans, the unglamorous heroes of medieval warfare. These humble legumes got packed into canvas sacks by the hundreds of pounds. Each pea or bean was rock-hard shriveled and looked completely unpromising, until you understood the magic. Soak them overnight, boil them for hours, and suddenly you had a thick, nutritious porridge that filled bellies and provided decent protein. Knights might have sneered at them as peasant food, but even nobles admitted that pea soup kept armies marching when the fancy provisions ran out. A single pound of dried peas could rehydrate into several pounds of cooked food, medieval food science at its finest. Your saddlebags also contained dried fruit if you were wealthy enough, apples, pears and plums that had been sliced thin and sun-dried into leathery strips. These weren't just treats, they were medical supplies. Medieval physicians believed that the sweetness and moisture helped balance the hot and dry humours created by eating too much salted meat. Whether the humour theory held up or not, the dried fruit did provide essential vitamins that prevented scurvy and other deficiency diseases. A knight who packed dried fruit was a knight who planned to stay healthy. Cheese, hard-aged cheese, filled another corner of your provisions. We're not talking about soft brie here. This was cheese that had been aged for months until it achieved an almost wax-like consistency. You could shave off pieces with a knife, and it would last for weeks, even in warm weather. The fat content provided concentrated calories, and unlike fresh cheese, it wouldn't turn into a puddle of spoiled milk after 3 days on the road. Some knights packed wheels of cheese the size of dinner plates, knowing they could gnaw on them throughout the campaign. And finally, tucked into whatever space remained, you'd find small luxuries that separated knights from common soldiers, a pouch of honey which never spoils and could treat wounds, perhaps some mustard seeds or dried herbs, maybe a small flask of vinegar for cleaning water or preserving fresh-caught game. These weren't extravagances, they were the tools that made survival slightly less miserable. The weight of all this staggering. A knight's personal food supply for a month could easily exceed £50, and that's not counting what the army supply train carried. You'd load as much as your pack horses could carry, knowing that once these provisions ran out you'd be dependent on whatever the quartermaster's wagons brought up, or whatever you could forage by or steal from the countryside. Historians still argue whether knights typically packed for 2 weeks or 2 months, but the consensus seems to be you packed as much as you possibly could, then prayed it would be enough. Picture yourself now looking at these saddlebags stuffed with food that tastes like survival rather than pleasure, the hardtack that requires a hammer to break, the meat that's more salt than flesh, the peas that look like pebbles. This is what stands between you and starvation. This is what you'll dream about when the supply wagons get ambushed and the foraging parties come back empty-handed. Welcome to medieval campaign dining where every bite is a small victory against the void. You've been marching for 5 days now, and the reality is starting to sink in. Those carefully packed provisions aren't going to last forever. Even if you rationed perfectly, which nobody does, when they're exhausted and hungry, you'd run out long before the campaign ends. So your commander does what every medieval army commander eventually does, he gives the order to forage. And just like that, you and your fellow soldiers become part-time hunters, gatherers and amateur botanists trying desperately not to poison yourselves. Foraging wasn't some casual suggestion, it was official military policy. Medieval armies moved through the landscape like locusts, taking what they needed to survive. But here's what makes it fascinating. There were actually rules. Complicated, often contradictory rules about what you could take from whom and when. A French ordinance from 1356 explicitly permitted soldiers to live off the land, but threatened hanging for anyone who touched church property. English campaigns in Scotland came with detailed instructions about which crops could be seized and which livestock was off limits. The punishment for breaking these rules. You might find yourself dangling from a tree as an example to others, even if you were just trying not to starve. So you're walking through a forest in what's now northern France, and you need to figure out what's safe to eat. Let's start with the obvious game. If you can catch it, you can probably eat it. Rabbits, deer, wild boar, these are familiar creatures, and your hunting skills from peacetime apply here. The problem, you're competing with hundreds or thousands of other hungry soldiers, and the local wildlife figures out pretty quickly that armies mean danger. Within days of an army passing through, the game disappears like smoke. Chronicles describe territories so thoroughly hunted that not even a squirrel remained. So while venison sounds lovely in theory and practice, you're more likely to spend hours tracking nothing. Birds, though, birds were more reliable. Pigeons, doves, waterfowl near rivers and marshes. Soldiers carried simple snares, and sometimes even trained hawks if they were wealthy enough. A pigeon wasn't much meat, but roasted over a campfire it was better than nothing. And here's a detail that always strikes me. Medieval soldiers knew exactly which birds were protected by law. Swans belonged to the crown. Peacocks belonged to nobles. Touch those and you weren't just stealing dinner, you were committing a status crime that could get you executed. But that scrawny duck paddling in the stream fair game. Now let's talk about plants, because this is where things get genuinely dangerous. You're walking through medieval countryside and you're surrounded by green things. Some will nourish you, some will kill you within hours. The challenge is knowing which is which, and most soldiers learned through a combination of local knowledge, trial and error, and watching what happened to the guy who ate that mushroom yesterday. Wild garlic that was safe. You could smell it before you saw it, and it grew abundantly in damp woodlands. Soldiers would stuff their pockets with the pungent leaves knowing they could flavour the eternal pea soup and maybe, just maybe, ward off illness. Nettles were safe too once you figured out how to harvest them without getting stung to hell. Boiled nettles tasted vaguely like spinach and provided much-needed greens when weeks of salted meat left you feeling like a preserved corpse yourself. Dandelions, the leaves, roots, even the flowers, all edible. Medieval soldiers knew this. The bitter leaves could be eaten raw or cooked, and the roots could be roasted into something almost coffee-like. Wild strawberries and blackberries in season were obvious treasures, though armies moved too fast to enjoy them for long. Chestnuts in autumn could be roasted or boiled into a starchy mush that filled bellies admirably. But then there were the deadly ones. Hemlock, which looked enough like wild parsley to fool hungry, desperate men. Foxglove beautiful and absolutely lethal. Deathcap mushrooms, which apparently tasted fine but destroyed your liver over the course of several agonizing days. Nightshade berries, tempting and colourful and full of poison. The chronicles don't dwell on these deaths much, just occasional mentions of soldiers who ate unwisely and died in their tents vomiting and convulsing while their companions looked on helplessly. Smart foragers followed one simple rule: if the locals ate it, you could probably eat it too. This meant watching peasants asking questions when possible, or simply observing what grew in village gardens. Wild cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips left in fields, these were recognizable and safe. But venture too far from human habitation into deep forests where strange fungi sprouted, and unfamiliar berries glistened, and you were gambling with your life. Here's something scholars still debate. How much did commanders actually control foraging? Some historians argue that once the order was given, it devolved into barely controlled chaos, with soldiers ranging miles from camp and taking whatever they wanted. Others point to records of organised foraging parties, assigned territories, and designated scouts who knew the local flora. The truth probably varied wildly depending on the army, the commander, and how desperately hungry everyone was. And there was always the risk of ambush. Soldiers foraging alone or in small groups made perfect targets for enemy scouts, local militias, or just angry peasants defending their land. You might set out looking for mushrooms and end up face down in a ditch with a crossbow bolt in your back. Foraging was survival, but it was also a calculated risk every single time you left camp. You're marching with 8,000 men through Normandy, and the quartermaster just announced that fresh bread will be available tomorrow. The reaction from the troops is almost religious-grown warriors nearly weeping with anticipation. Because here's something modern people don't quite grasp in medieval warfare: bread wasn't just food. It was hope. It was civilization. It was the difference between an army that could fight and a mob that would mutiny. And making that bread happen in the middle of a war zone required some of the most impressive logistics you've never heard about. Enter the mobile bakery, one of medieval warfare's strangest and most essential inventions. These weren't food trucks, obviously. We're talking about actual ovens built on reinforced wagons, or sometimes assembled and disassembled as armies moved. Picture a heavy cart carrying a dome-shaped clay or brick oven surrounded by sacks of flour, barrels of water, and exhausted bakers who hadn't slept properly in weeks. Some larger armies travelled with dozens of these oven wagons, each one capable of producing hundreds of loaves daily. The French called them Fournils mobiles, and they were as crucial to campaign success as any siege engine. The ovens themselves were engineering marvels in their own right. Built from fire-resistant clay and sometimes reinforced with iron bands, they had to withstand constant heating and cooling, the jolting of rough roads and occasionally enemy fire. The best ones could maintain temperature for hours, allowing bakers to produce batch after batch without wasting fuel. Fuel now, There's another problem. These ovens consumed enormous amounts of wood, and that meant foraging parties weren't just looking for food, they were looking for burnable timber in territories that might already be stripped bare. Here's how it worked in practice. The army would establish camp for the night, and immediately the bakers would start their work. While you were setting up your tent and tending to your horse, these men were mixing massive quantities of dough in wooden troughs, kneading until their arms screamed. The dough was simple flour, water, salt, sometimes a bit of starter saved from the previous batch for leavening. No time for fancy recipes when you're feeding thousands. They'd let it rise for a few hours if time permitted, but often necessity meant baking it half-risen or completely flat. The baking itself was an all-night affair. The ovens would be fired up using whatever wood the foragers had gathered, brought to scorching temperatures and then loaded with loaves. Each baking cycle took roughly 30 to 45 minutes, and a single oven might complete 6 or 7 cycles before dawn. Do the math. If each cycle produced 50 loaves and you had 10 ovens working, that's 3,000 to 3,500 loaves per night. Sounds impressive until you remember you're feeding 8,000 men, and each man needs about 1.5 pounds of bread daily just to function. Suddenly you realize the bakers are performing miracles just to keep everyone barely fed. The bread itself, let's be honest, was nothing like what you'd buy at a bakery today. Medieval campaign bread was dense, heavy, often gritty, with poorly milled flour or contaminated with whatever debris had gotten mixed in during the chaos. It was frequently underbaked in the centre, because speed mattered more than perfection. Sometimes it was burned on the outside because the oven temperature was impossible to regulate precisely. Soldiers complained constantly about the quality, but they ate every crumb, because the alternative was going hungry. And here's something fascinating that historians love to argue about bread quality as a military morale indicator. There are records of armies on the verge of mutiny who were pacified by the arrival of fresh bread. Conversely, there are accounts of troops refusing to fight because the bread ration had been cut or the quality had deteriorated too far. Edward III supposedly threatened to hang a baker who'd been caught mixing sawdust into the flour to stretch supplies, not because of the deception itself, but because word got out and morale plummeted. Bread was psychological warfare waged against your own soldiers' despair. The logistics get even more complicated when you consider flour supply. Grain is heavy and bulky, so armies couldn't carry enough for months of campaigning. Instead, supply trains would bring grain from rear areas often purchased or requisitioned from local mills. But mills required water or wind power. They couldn't just pop up anywhere. So armies often followed rivers specifically to stay near mills, or they'd seize existing mills and force them into military service. There are documented cases of millers being conscripted at sword point, ordered to grind grain day and night for passing armies, paid in promises or threats rather than coin. Some commanders got creative. There are records of hand-powered querns, small grinding stones being distributed to companies allowing soldiers to grind their own flour from whole grain. This was brutally hard work, and the resulting flour was coarse and full of grit that wore down teeth. But it meant a company could produce bread, even when separated from the main supply train. The English were particularly known for this approach during their Scottish campaigns, where supply lines were notoriously unreliable, and when the ovens couldn't keep up, or when the army was moving too fast to bake properly, that's when hardtack returned with a vengeance. Remember that tooth-breaking biscuit from earlier, but even hardtack required ovens to produce initially just baked to death, until it achieved immortality. The mobile bakeries would sometimes spend days doing nothing but producing hardtack, building up reserves for the rapid march phases of the campaign. Picture the scene now. It's 3 a.m. and you wake up to use the latrine. You pass by the baker's area, and it's an inferno of activity. Shirtless men covered in flour and sweat shoving paddle after paddle of dough into glowing ovens. The smell of baking bread mixing with wood smoke and the general reek of the camp. The heat so intense you can feel it from 20 feet away. These men haven't stopped working since sunset, and they won't stop until dawn. They're not warriors. They'll never be celebrated in songs. But without them, this entire army would collapse in a matter of weeks. That's the strange, beautiful, exhausting reality of keeping medieval soldiers fed. You wake up in your tent at dawn and your head feels like it's been stuffed with wool. Your mouth tastes like something died in it. You're thirsty beyond belief, and the first thought that crosses your mind isn't "I need water," it's "I need ale." Because here's one of those medieval realities that sounds bizarre to modern ears. Water was genuinely dangerous, and ale was genuinely survival. Not beer, as we know it today, but a thick, nutritious, low-alcohol beverage that kept armies functioning when every other liquid source wanted to kill you. Let's start with why water was such a problem. You're camped near a river seems perfect, right? Except that river also serves as the latrine for 8,000 men and their animals. Upstream there might be a village dumping its waste. There might be dead animals rotting in the current. There might be absolutely nothing wrong with it at all, but you have no way to know, and medieval medicine doesn't understand germ theory yet. What they do understand through bitter experience is that soldiers who drink from questionable water sources end up with the flux dysentery, which kills you through dehydration and exhaustion faster than most battle wounds. So armies drank ale instead. And not just a little ale, we're talking quantities that would make a modern alcoholic look like an amateur. The standard daily ration for an English soldier was about a gallon of ale. A gallon. That's roughly 8 pints, or 3.8 litres if you prefer metric. Knights and nobles often received double rations. You'd drink ale with breakfast during the march, with lunch at dinner and before bed. It was hydration, calories, and mild sedation all in one package. But this wasn't strong ale. The alcohol content was typically around 2 to 3%, about half the strength of modern beer. Just enough to kill bacteria in the water used to brew it, not enough to leave you stumbling drunk when you needed to fight. Think of it as liquid bread, because that's essentially what it was. The brewing process used malted grains, usually barley, sometimes wheat or oats, which provided substantial calories. A gallon of medieval ale contained somewhere between 600 and 800 calories, roughly a quarter of a hard-working soldier's daily needs. You weren't just drinking to stay hydrated, you were drinking to stay alive. The brewing happened in mobile ale wagons that followed the army like the bakery ovens we talked about earlier. These were essentially travelling breweries complete with massive copper or iron kettles, fermentation barrels, and exhausted brewers who worked around the clock. The process was simpler than modern brewing, but still required skill and timing. You'd start with malted grain, mix it with hot water to create a mash, let it steep until the sugar's extracted, then boil the resulting liquid called wort with herbs for flavour and preservation. Hops weren't standard yet in most of Europe during the earlier medieval period. Instead, brewers used something called gruit, a mixture of herbs that varied by region, but typically included yarrow, wild rosemary, juniper berries, and mugwort. Gruit served multiple purposes. It flavoured the ale, helped preserve it, and supposedly had mild medicinal properties. Some historians argue that gruit also had mild psychoactive effects, though this remains hotly debated. What's not debated is that gruit ale tasted nothing like modern beer, more herbal, more bitter, sometimes almost medicinal. The fermentation happened fast out of necessity. Brewers would pitch yeast often, wild yeast captured from the air or saved from previous batches, and within 24 to 48 hours the ale was drinkable. Not mature, not refined, but adequate. It would be cloudy, thick with sediment and taste a bit rough, but it was safe and it was calories. The barrels would be sealed and loaded onto wagons, and the ale would continue fermenting slightly as the army moved, sometimes arriving at camp more alcoholic than intended due to the jostling and temperature changes. Now here's where it gets interesting from a logistics standpoint. Ale is heavy. A gallon weighs about 8 pounds. If you're providing a gallon per soldier per day, for an army of 10,000 that's 80,000 pounds of ale, daily 40 tons. And ale doesn't last long, especially the quick-brewed campaign variety. Within a week it could start turning sour or developing off flavours. So the brewing had to be continuous, the supply had to be constant, and the wagons had to keep moving, or you'd have an army-wide sobering up that would destroy morale faster than any enemy action. Some armies solved this by contracting with local breweries as they marched. Lords would be encouraged, often at sword point, to provide ale from their estates. Monasteries, which often ran the best breweries, would find themselves requisitioned. There are records of monks petitioning kings to spare their brewing operations not out of mercy, but because the army needed their output. The monks would keep brewing, soldiers would keep drinking, and everyone would pretend this was somehow voluntary cooperation rather than armed appropriation. And when the ale ran out, that's when things got desperate. Soldiers would drink wine if it was available, but wine was expensive and usually reserved for officers. They'd drink cider if they were in apple country. They'd even resort to water boiled if they were smart and pray they didn't pay for it with a week of intestinal agony. Chronicles describe armies grinding to a halt not because they lacked weapons or will, but because the ale wagons got ambushed, or the local breweries couldn't keep up with demand. There's also a social dimension here that fascinates me. Sharing ale was how medieval soldiers bonded. After a long march, sitting around a fire, passing a leather flask or wooden cup, complaining about officers and telling exaggerated stories, this was the glue that held companies together. The ale lowered inhibitions just enough that men could admit their fears, comfort each other, maintain the human connections that made unbearable situations bearable. It was therapy in a cup administered in doses that would horrify modern addiction counsellors, but made perfect sense in a world where tomorrow might bring death, and today brought nothing but hardship. Picture yourself now at day's end, your ration of ale in hand. It's lukewarm, cloudy, tastes vaguely of herbs and grain. You can feel the grit of sediment between your teeth, but it's wet, it's filling, and after you drink it, the aches in your legs don't hurt quite as much. The fear sitting in your chest loosens its grip just slightly. You're not drunk, you're just less miserable, and in medieval warfare that's close enough to happiness. You're 3 weeks into the campaign and the supply wagons haven't arrived in 4 days. The hardtack is running low, the ale barrels are getting light, and then you hear it, the unmistakable sound that means dinner is still possible, bleating, lowing, grunting, and the general cacophony of livestock on the move. Because medieval armies didn't just carry food, they brought food that was still alive, still walking, and deeply unhappy about the entire situation. Picture the scene behind the fighting men. Behind the supply wagons and the mobile ovens, there's a moving disaster of animals. Cattle herded by boys too young to fight. Sheep bunched together in nervous clusters. Pigs rooting through whatever they can find, occasionally escaping and causing chaos. Chickens in wicker cages stacked on carts squawking at every bump. Goats tied in strings, their stubborn personalities making them possibly the most difficult component of the entire military operation. This mobile farmyard might contain hundreds, or even thousands of animals depending on the size of the army, and keeping them alive, fed and moving in the right direction was a nightmare that never ended. Let's talk about cattle first because they were the premium protein source. A single cow represented an enormous investment, probably worth more than a common soldier's annual wages, but also an enormous payoff. One cow properly butchered could feed 50 men for a day, with rich fatty meat that provided serious calories. The problem cows are slow stubborn and require substantial fodder. They need to graze for hours daily, or be fed hay and grain resources the army was already struggling to secure for horses, and they drink astonishing amounts of water. A full-grown cow needs 10 to 15 gallons per day. So every cow in the column was competing with soldiers and war horses for access to streams and rivers. The cattle herders, usually boys between 10 and 14, too young for combat, but old enough to work, had one of the genuinely terrible jobs in the medieval military hierarchy. They walked all day, keeping the herd together, sleeping in shifts to guard against wolves or thieves, existing in a constant state of exhausted vigilance. When a cow went lame or sick, they'd report it to the quartermaster, who'd make the cold calculation slaughter it now for meat, or try to keep it moving and risk losing the investment entirely. More often than not, the answer was slaughter, which meant fresh meat for a few companies and one less mouth to feed going forward. Sheep were easier. Smaller, less demanding, they could graze on marginal land that cows would ignore. A sheep ate about 2 to 3% of its body weight daily in vegetation, which sounds like a lot until you compare it to a cow. And mutton, while less prestigious than beef, was perfectly acceptable to medieval palates, especially when you hadn't tasted fresh meat in weeks. The wool was a bonus. Even on-campaign sheep could be sheared and the wool used for repairs to clothing or sold to locals for extra coins. But sheep had their own problems. They panicked easily. They attracted wolves and wild dogs like magnets, and during river crossings they'd sometimes simply give up and drown rather than swim. Medieval chronicles are full of offhand mentions of losing 30 sheep to the river, written with the weary tone of someone describing an inevitable disaster. Pigs, though. Pigs were the secret weapon of medieval provisioning. Hear me out. A pig will eat literally anything. Spoiled grain. The pig loves it. Food scraps from the officers' meals, pig food. Dead animal carcasses. Pigs will consume them enthusiastically. They're walking garbage disposals that convert waste into bacon. Plus, pigs are surprisingly hardy travellers. They can walk 10 to 15 miles a day without much complaint. They don't need elaborate care. And when you butcher one, almost everything is usable. The meat can be eaten fresh salted for preservation, rendered into lard for cooking and waterproofing. Even the blood got made into sausages. The intestines became casings. The hide could be turned into leather. A pig was a complete resource package with legs. The downside pigs are smart, which means they're also devious. They'd escape their pens, wander into other parts of the camp route through supplies, cause fights, when soldiers from different companies argued over whose pig was whose. There are records of military courts convening to settle pig-related disputes. Grown knights arguing under oath about pig ownership. Welcome to medieval warfare where dignity goes to die. Chickens were the daily egg suppliers when stress and travel didn't shut down their laying entirely. A chicken that actually produced eggs on campaign was worth its weight in something valuable, possibly silver. Those eggs went to sick or wounded soldiers, or to officers as a privilege of rank. The chickens themselves were eventually destined for the pot, but smart quartermasters tried to keep them alive as long as possible, because eggs represented protein you could harvest repeatedly. The problem was keeping them alive. Chickens are fragile, prone to disease, and attractive to every predator in the European countryside. Fox attacks on the chicken cages were apparently so common that guards were specifically posted to watch them at night. And then there were the goats. Stubborn, aggressive, surprisingly strong, and capable of eating vegetation that even sheep wouldn't touch. goat milk and cheese were prized especially for the sick, but actually milking a goat while the army was on the move required a special kind of patience. Historians still debate whether medieval armies brought dairy goats in significant numbers, but there's enough evidence of goat mentions in supply records to suggest that yes, some poor soul was indeed chasing goats around camp every morning, trying to extract milk while under possible enemy observation. The brutal reality was this: the livestock column steadily shrank as the campaign progressed. Animals went lame and got slaughtered. They died from disease or exhaustion. They were stolen by locals or enemy scouts. They were consumed for special occasions or when regular supplies failed. Some armies started campaigns with enough livestock to feed themselves for weeks, and arrived at their destination with barely a dozen animals remaining. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse rode with medieval armies, and one of them was definitely herding very unhappy sheep. Now picture yourself as a knight riding past this mobile farmyard disaster. The smell is apocalyptic, thousands of animals producing waste continuously with minimal cleanup. The noise is maddening. But you know that tonight or tomorrow or whenever the quartermaster decides one of these bleating, mooing creatures will become your dinner. And that knowledge, that promise of fresh meat instead of eternal hardtack and salt pork, makes the entire stinking, chaotic mess almost beautiful. Almost. You're sitting in your tent on a grey afternoon somewhere in the Low Countries and someone hands you a piece of fish. Not fresh fish that would be a miracle. No, this is preserved fish, and the smell hits you before you even see it. It's pungent, salty, vaguely metallic, and somehow both repulsive and appetizing at the same time because you're so desperately tired of salted pork. Welcome to one of medieval warfare's strangest staples, the preserved fish trade that fed crusaders, kept sieges going, and occasionally made entire camps smell like a harbour at low tide. Let's start with herring, because herring was everywhere. The North Sea and Baltic virtually boiled with these silvery fish during spawning season, and medieval fishing fleets harvested them by the millions. A single fishing boat could pull in thousands of herring in a good day, and coastal towns built entire economies around catching, processing and shipping them. But fresh herring spoils within hours, especially in pre-refrigeration times, so preservation was everything. The fish would be gutted, usually by women working in massive processing operations on the docks, then packed in barrels with alternating layers of coarse salt. Salt fish, until the barrel was full and sealed. The result was something that could last for months or even years. Salted herring became so important to medieval trade that wars were fought over fishing rights. The Hanseatic League, that powerful confederation of merchant cities, built much of its wealth on herring, and armies knew that a convoy of herring barrels meant protein that wouldn't spoil, wouldn't escape, and required zero maintenance beyond keeping the barrel sealed. A single barrel contained about 500 to 700 fish, and those fish represented thousands of meals. Do the math on feeding a large army, and suddenly you're looking at wagons loaded with dozens of barrels, each one sloshing with brine and tightly packed fish bodies. Eating salted herring required preparation. You couldn't just bite into one, your mouth would shrivel from the salt content and you'd be desperately thirsty for hours. Instead, cooks would soak the fish in fresh water sometimes for a full day, drawing out enough salt to make them edible. Then they'd be grilled over fires, boiled in soups, or occasionally fried if fat was available. The flesh would flake apart, still salty but tolerable, and provide that precious fish oil and protein that kept scurvy at bay and muscles functioning. Soldiers complained about the taste, the bones, the eternal sameness of it, but they ate every scrap. Cod was the premium option, especially dried cod, what the Portuguese called bacalhau, and the English called stockfish. This wasn't salted like herring. This was air-dried until it achieved the consistency of a wooden plank. Seriously, stockfish was so hard that soldiers used to joke you could kill someone with it before you could eat it. The drying process took weeks and required specific climate conditions, cold, dry, breezy, which meant most stockfish came from Norway, Iceland, and the northern reaches where the weather cooperated. But here's the genius of stockfish: it lasted indefinitely. Years, even decades if stored properly. The fish became so desiccated that bacteria couldn't survive, and as long as it stayed dry, it remained edible. To prepare it, you had to soak it for days. Some recipes called for a full week of soaking, changing the water daily until it softened enough to cook. Then it would be boiled or baked, and what emerged was surprisingly pleasant, mild-flavoured fish that could be made into stews, mixed with vegetables, or eaten with bread. The nutritional profile was excellent, high-protein, low-fat, rich in minerals. The Norwegian and Icelandic fishing villages that produced stockfish became wealthy beyond imagination. They'd dry thousands of cod on massive wooden racks, the fish hanging like strange laundry under cold northern skies, and then merchants would buy them by the shipload. These ships would sail south, stopping at ports where military provisioners waited with gold and contracts. Some armies relied so heavily on stockfish that it appeared in their supply records more frequently than bread. Then there's pickled eel, which sounds horrifying to modern sensibilities, but was actually prized. Eels were abundant in European rivers and could be caught in traps with minimal effort. Once caught, they'd be gutted, cut into sections, and packed in barrels with vinegar salt and sometimes herbs. The acidity of the vinegar preserved the flesh, while adding flavour that cut through the eel's natural fattiness. Pickled eel could last for months and provided rich, oily protein that was genuinely delicious, if you could get past the whole eating a snake-like fish psychology. Some armies also carried dried fish, roe fish oils in leather flasks, and even preserved shellfish when coastal campaigns made them available. There are records of mussel and oyster barrels being loaded onto ships, the shellfish still alive in seawater transported to army camps where they'd be consumed within days before they spoiled. This was risky. Shellfish are incredibly prone to toxin buildup, but when it worked, it provided a luxury that boosted morale tremendously. The logistics of the fish trade were mind-boggling. Fish caught in Norway needed to reach armies campaigning in France or the Holy Land. This meant complex supply chains involving fishing boats, merchant ships, river barges, and ox carts. Weather could destroy entire shipments. Pirates targeted fish convoys because preserved fish was valuable, portable, and had a ready market. There are documented cases of battles being delayed because the fish shipment got intercepted, leaving armies too malnourished to fight effectively. And here's something scholars still argue about: did the medieval Catholic requirement of meatless days Fridays and feast days actually help or hinder military campaigns? Some historians argue that armies moving through Catholic territories could more easily requisition or purchase fish because the infrastructure was already there. The local population already consumed it regularly. Others point out that it created supply bottlenecks when entire armies suddenly demanded fish on Fridays, straining resources that were already stretched thin. The debate continues, but what's certain is that religious fish consumption created a market that military provisioners exploited ruthlessly. Picture the scene now: the supply wagons arrive and soldiers crowd around as barrels are cracked open. The smell of brine and fish floods the camp, mixing with wood smoke and general army funk. Men reach in with bare hands, pulling out stiff salt-crusted herring or rock-hard stockfish that will need days of soaking. It's not appetizing by any modern standard, but you watch their faces light up anyway, because this is variety, this is different. This is something other than the eternal rotation of salted pork and hardtack. In the economy of medieval military suffering, preserved fish counts as a small victory. You're standing in line for your evening meal, and you watch as the quartermaster's assistant doles out portions. The knight 3 places ahead of you receives a thick slice of roasted venison, still steaming along with white bread and a cup of wine. The man-at-arms next to you gets a bowl of bean pottage with a small piece of bacon floating in it, and a chunk of dark bread. You as a lesser knight or professional soldier fall somewhere in between, perhaps some mutton stew and decent bread, definitely ale instead of wine. Welcome to one of medieval warfare's most rigid hierarchies, the dining table that reflected the entire social order, where your status determined not just how much you ate, but what you ate, and how you ate it. Let's start at the top. High nobles, earls, barons, knights, banneret dined as well on campaign as they did at home, or at least they tried to. Their provisions came from personal supply trains carried by their own servants and protected by their own guards. They ate roasted meats venison from deer they'd hunted during rest days, beef from the best cattle pork from grain-fed pigs. Their bread was made from finely milled wheat flour, white and soft, called mancha bread. They drank wine, often imported, sometimes spiced and heated. Their meals included luxuries like dried fruits, nuts, honey, even sugar if they were extraordinarily wealthy. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, ginger appeared in their dishes, not just for flavour, but as displays of wealth and status. These nobles often maintained something resembling proper dining etiquette even in war zones. They'd eat at table sometimes with cloth coverings. They'd use plates wooden or pewter, and have servants carve their meat. There are accounts of nobles dressing for dinner in campaign, changing out of armour into cleaner clothes, maintaining the rituals of civilized dining, even while surrounded by thousands of mud-soaked soldiers. Some historians view this as admirable dedication to civilization, others see it as tone-deaf arrogance. Probably it was both. The psychological purpose was clear, maintaining hierarchy, reminding everyone of their place, ensuring that even in the chaos of war, the social order remained visible and enforced. A common soldier who saw his lord dining well might resent it, but he'd also draw comfort from it. The fact that someone still had access to wine and roasted meat suggested that not everything had collapsed into barbarism. There was still structure, still order, still a world to return to. Regular knights, the backbone of medieval armies, ate significantly less impressively. They'd receive meat more often than common soldiers, but it was often tougher cuts, organ meats, or smaller portions. Their bread was darker, made from wheat mixed with rye or barley. They drank ale rather than wine, though in larger quantities than foot soldiers. Their meals were cooked communally, with several knights sharing from the same pot, or splitting a roasted chicken between them. They might have access to some preserved fruits, a bit of cheese, occasionally some pickled vegetables. It was adequate, nutritious, but rarely exciting. Then we get to the men-at-arms and professional soldiers, the ones who fought on foot, who weren't nobility but weren't peasant levies either. These men formed the middle tier of military society, and their food reflected it. They ate pottage, that eternal medieval stew of grains, peas, onions, and whatever else was available. Sometimes it contained small pieces of meat, usually bacon or salt pork, added for flavour rather than substance. Their bread was coarse, made from rye, barley, or even oats, and often mixed with whatever grain was cheapest. Dark bread, heavy bread that filled your stomach but didn't delight your palate. They drank ale, of course, remember that gallon-a-day ration, and that ale was often thinner and more roughly brewed than what the knights received. But here's something interesting: these men often ate better on campaign than they did at home. For many professional soldiers, military service meant regular meals, something they might not have had as peasants or labourers. The army fed you predictably, even if it fed you boring food. That was actually an incentive for recruitment. Join the army, never wonder where your next meal is coming from. The food might be monotonous and uninspiring, but it was reliable in a way that civilian life often wasn't. At the bottom were the peasant levies, temporary soldiers conscripted for specific campaigns. These men received the absolute minimum thin pottage, made mostly from peas or beans, with minimal flavour enhancement, the darkest and coarsest bread ale that was often the final dregs of the barrels. They rarely saw meat unless an animal died and had to be consumed quickly. They foraged aggressively for anything that might supplement their rations: wild garlic nettles, roots insect if they were desperate enough. Their meals were survival, not sustenance with dignity. The inequality was stark and deliberate. Medieval society believed in hierarchical order as a divine mandate, and food was one of the clearest ways to demonstrate that order. The nobleman's roasted venison wasn't just a meal, it was a symbol of his superior blood and God-given right to rule. The peasant's thin soup wasn't just cheap provisioning, it was a reminder of his place in creation's hierarchy. But inequalities created tensions. Chronicles are full of near mutinies over food distribution. Soldiers watching nobles feast while they went hungry sometimes snapped. There are records of food riots in military camps of soldiers stealing from supply wagons, meant for officers of entire companies deserting, because they felt their rations were inadequate while commanders lived well. Smart leaders knew to manage this carefully, keeping hierarchies clear but not so extreme that common soldiers felt entirely disposable. Some commanders actively worked to narrow the gap during critical moments. Henry V of England famously ate soldiers' rations the night before Agincourt, sitting with his men and sharing their pottage. This wasn't generosity, it was calculated leadership. He knew morale was fragile, and the gesture of a king eating common food created a bond that might mean the difference between men standing firm or breaking when the French cavalry charged. Whether he actually enjoyed that pottage or forced it down while dreaming of roasted swan is a question chroniclers diplomatically avoided. There's also evidence of soldiers creating their own informal food economies. Men would trade barter and share. A man-at-arms who'd received extra cheese might trade it to a levy soldier for help mending his equipment. Knights might share wine with their squires to ensure loyalty. Foraging parties would sometimes bring back game and split it among their entire squad, rather than turning it all over to quartermasters. These underground food networks helped soften the harsh official hierarchies and created bonds that transcended social class. Picture yourself now at evening meal watching the social order made edible. The nobles in their section servants moving between them with platters. The knights clustered around their own fires passing bread and meat. The common soldiers hunched over bowls of pottage eating quickly before someone decides their portion was too generous. Everyone hungry, everyone tired, everyone united by the need to eat but divided by what they are allowed to consume. It's the entire medieval world compressed into dinner time, a hierarchy you can taste, smell, and deeply resent. You're exhausted from a day's march, and finally the order comes to make camp. Within minutes, the organised chaos begins. Tents go up, horses get tended, and almost immediately the smoke starts rising, dozens, then hundreds of small fires, appearing across the landscape like stars blinking into existence. Because no matter how sophisticated the army's supply chain might be, no matter how many mobile bakeries and ale wagons follow behind, the actual cooking happens in the mud and grass, in trenches and over open flames, using tools and techniques that would make a modern health inspector weep with despair. Let's start with the most basic setup, the cooking pit. Soldiers would dig a shallow trench, maybe a foot deep, 2 feet wide as long as needed, and line it with stones if they had time. The stones served double duty. They protected the fire from wind and retained heat for more even cooking. Dry wood would be gathered, another endless task that required foraging parties to range far from camp, and the fire started using flint and steel, or if you were lucky, hot coals preserved from the previous night wrapped in damp cloth. Getting a fire going from scratch could take 15 frustrating minutes of sparks and cursing, which is why experienced soldiers guarded their coals like treasure. Once the fire was established, the cooking could begin, and by cooking, we mostly mean boiling. The workhorse of medieval field cooking was the cauldron, a heavy iron pot suspended over the fire by a tripod or laid directly on stones. Every company would have at least one, sometimes several, and these cauldrons would simmer continuously from late afternoon until everyone had eaten. Into them went water, hopefully clean dried peas or beans pre-soaked, if there was time, chunks of salted meat, wild onions or garlic, if the foragers found any, and whatever grain could be spared. The result was pottage, that eternal medieval stew that appeared at virtually every common soldier's meal. Here's what you need to understand about pottage. It was infinitely adaptable and almost indestructible. Too thin, let it boil down. Too thick, add water. Something tastes off. Throw in more salt or some foraged herbs. The beauty of communal pot cooking was that mistakes disappeared into the general mass, and the long cooking time meant that even questionable ingredients got rendered safe through heat. Plus, the cauldron could stay on the fire all evening, staying hot while soldiers came in shifts to eat. It was slow food in the most literal sense, but it fed hundreds efficiently. Roasting happened when fresh meat was available. Remember that cattle or sheep from earlier. The methods were primitive but effective. The simplest approach was the spit, a green wood pole sharpened at one end driven into the ground at an angle over the fire. You'd skewer chunks of meat onto it and rotate periodically to cook evenly. Someone, usually a squire or a young soldier, would be assigned to turn the spit, a hot, smoky, boring job that nonetheless was better than latrine duty. The meat would drip fat into the flames, causing flare-ups and smoke that made your eyes water. But the smell was absolutely intoxicating to men who'd been eating preserved food for weeks. Larger pieces, whole haunches of meat, entire chickens would be suspended from more elaborate frameworks. There's evidence of armies carrying collapsible metal grills, essentially iron grates that could be placed over fires for more controlled cooking. Wealthier knights might have their own portable cooking setups, miniature kitchens packed onto wagons that included proper pots, pans, and even baking equipment for making fresh pastries. The contrast between a common soldier roasting scavenged rabbit on a stick and a noble's servant preparing roasted duck with herb sauce captures the entire medieval social divide in culinary form. Bread baking in the field, when not done in the mobile ovens we discussed, happened in improvised earth ovens. Soldiers would dig a pit, heat rocks until they glowed, rake out the fireplace dough on the hot stones and cover everything with earth and hot coals. Hours later you'd dig up something resembling bread, usually ash-covered and partially charred but technically edible. This camp bread was desperately inferior to oven-baked loaves, but when the ovens couldn't keep up or your unit was separated from the main supply train, it meant the difference between having bread and not having bread. Now let's talk about the tools. Most soldiers carried a knife, not a weapon, but an eating knife with a 4 to 6 inch blade. This knife was your fork, spoon, cutting board and general problem solver. You'd use it to cut bread spear meat from the communal pot, scrape the bottom of your bowl and perform minor repairs on equipment. Soldiers literally ate with their knives, a practice that continued for centuries. Spoons existed but were often personal possessions carved from wood during downtime. Forks were virtually unknown outside noble households. They wouldn't become common in Europe for several more centuries. Bowls and plates were usually wood, lightweight, unbreakable, easily replaced. Each soldier carried his own, often hanging from his belt. After meals, you'd wipe your bowl out with bread, remember wasting food was unthinkable, or rinse it in a stream if one was available. Hygiene was whatever you made it, which is to say it was minimal. The same knife that cleaned a fish in the morning might cut your dinner bread in the evening with no washing in between beyond maybe wiping it on your tunic. The camp kitchen, if we can dignify it with that term, operated in a constant state of barely controlled chaos. Multiple fires going simultaneously, smoke everywhere, men crowding around cauldrons jockeying for position, arguments over portions, the inevitable spillages and minor burns, the ever-present risk of starting a larger fire that could spread to tents and supplies. Most armies had designated cooking areas kept away from tents and ammunition stores, but accidents still happened. There are records of camps partially destroyed by cooking fires that got out of control, especially on windy nights. And then there was clean-up, or the lack thereof. Pots got scraped out and maybe rinsed. Ashes got kicked away from the fire pit. Food scraps attracted rats, dogs and flies, but were rarely properly disposed of. The smell of thousands of cooking fires combined with food waste, animal manure and general camp filth created an atmosphere that medieval soldiers simply accepted as normal. Your nose adjusted after a few days, or at least that's what veterans claimed. Picture the evening scene, now the sun setting, hundreds of fires glowing across the landscape. The smell of wood smoke and cooking food drifting on the breeze. Men clustered around their cooking pits, some stirring cauldrons, others turning spits, a few just sitting and staring into flames while their dinner simmers. The sounds of conversation, occasional laughter, the crackle of burning wood, the hiss of fat dripping into fire. It's not elegant, it's not clean, but its life sustained one fire and one cauldron at a time in the middle of a war that might kill everyone here before the month ends. You're sitting by the fire after a long day, chewing on a piece of meat that's been salted within an inch of its existence, and someone passes you a small leather pouch. Inside are a few precious peppercorns, dark and wrinkled like tiny seeds of luxury. You crush one between your teeth, and suddenly the bland preserved flavour transforms into something almost interesting. That single peppercorn, worth more than the meat you're eating, represents one of medieval warfare's strangest intersections, the point where medicine status and survival met in the form of spices that travelled thousands of miles to end up in a muddy military camp. Let's be clear about something. First, spices on medieval campaigns weren't primarily about making food taste good, though that was a welcome side effect. They were about preservation, about medicine, and most importantly about demonstrating that you were important enough to afford them. Pepper, the most common spice, was expensive. A pound of peppercorns could cost as much as a labourer's weekly wages. Ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, even more costly. These were luxury goods that travelled along trade routes from India, Southeast Asia and East Africa, passing through multiple hands and accumulating cost at every stage before ending up in European markets. So why would armies carry them? Start with the preservation angle. Medieval people believed correctly, as it turns out, that spices helped keep meat from spoiling. The antimicrobial properties of many spices do actually slow bacterial growth, though not as dramatically as salt or proper refrigeration. But even the marginal benefit mattered when you're dealing with meat that's been sitting in a wagon for weeks in variable temperatures. A commander who spiced the preserved meat wasn't being extravagant. He was trying to prevent his army from dying of food poisoning. Then there's the masking function. Salted meat, especially when it started to go off, tasted and smelled terrible. Spices could cover that up, making borderline spoiled food tolerable enough to eat. This wasn't deception exactly. Everyone knew the meat was questionable, but it was psychological warfare against your own disgust reflex. Pepper's sharp bite and ginger's heat could overwhelm the beginning notes of rot, letting soldiers consume calories they might otherwise refuse. In a world where throwing away food meant potentially starving, later spices bought you an extra few days of edibility from provisions that were technically past their prime. But here's where it gets fascinating from a medieval perspective: humoral medicine. You need to understand that medieval physicians believed the body contained 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness resulted from these humours becoming imbalanced. Different foods had different humoral properties. Meat was considered hot and moist. Preserved meat that had been heavily salted became hot and dry. Too much hot and dry food would in theory create an imbalance that led to illness. Spices were the correction mechanism. Pepper was considered hot and dry, which sounds counterproductive, but medieval medicine was complex. Ginger was hot and moist, perfect for counteracting overly salty food. Cinnamon was hot and dry, but also had special properties that aided digestion. Cloves were hot and dry, and supposedly helped with everything from toothaches to digestive problems. A skilled commander or physician travelling with the army would actually prescribe spice combinations based on what the troops were eating and what illnesses were appearing in camp. There are documented cases of armies carrying dedicated medicine chests that were essentially elaborate spice boxes. These would contain not just the common spices, but also more exotic and expensive items: cube pepper, long pepper, galangal, grains of paradise. Each had specific medical applications. Soldiers suffering from digestive complaints might receive ginger tea. Men with respiratory issues might inhale steam, infused with cloves and cinnamon. The line between medicine and cooking was essentially non-existent. Your dinner and your cure came from the same supplies. Now let's talk about the hierarchy of spices, because even among these luxury goods there were gradations. Pepper was common enough that even relatively modest knights might carry some. It was the gateway spice, the minimum standard for anyone claiming status above a common soldier. Ginger was more expensive but still appeared fairly regularly in military inventories. Cinnamon represented a step up. This was reserved for nobles and high officers, used sparingly and ceremonially. Cloves, nutmeg, and especially saffron. These were the realm of princes and bishops, the kind of spices that appeared at command dinners and diplomatic meals, but rarely made it to regular campaign cooking. The spice trade's logistics during wartime were genuinely impressive. Merchants would follow armies knowing that officers would pay premium prices for luxury goods that reminded them of home. Venice and Genoa, the great Italian merchant republics, made fortunes supplying crusader armies with spices. There are records of spice shipments being given military escorts treated as strategically important as weapons or gold. In some cases, the promise of spices was used to secure alliances or negotiate with local lords who controlled trade routes. And here's something scholars debate intensely: did the spice trade actually influence military strategy? Some historians argue that crusader routes through the eastern Mediterranean were chosen partly to secure access to spice markets. Others point to campaigns that deliberately targeted spice-producing regions or trade hubs. The counter-argument is that this overstates spices' importance. They were valuable, yes, but not valuable enough to determine where armies marched. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Spices didn't dictate strategy, but they influenced it, adding economic incentive to military movements. There's also a psychological dimension that's easy to overlook. A noble eating spiced meat in his tent wasn't just enjoying better flavour, he was maintaining his identity. He was asserting that despite the mud, the danger, the primitive conditions, he remained a sophisticated person with refined tastes. The spices connected him to the civilized world of courts and manors, reminded him that this campaign would eventually end, and he'd return to a life where cinnamon and cloves were regular features of dining. For soldiers of lower rank who occasionally tasted spiced food, perhaps from an officer's generosity or as a special ration, it represented hope. The world still contained luxury and pleasure, even if those things felt impossibly distant. But let's also acknowledge the dark side spice fraud. Given their value, spices were frequently adulterated. Pepper might be mixed with cheaper peppercorns, or even ground plant matter to stretch supplies. Saffron, already phenomenally expensive, was notoriously subject to counterfeiting with dyed silk threads or flower petals. Military quartermasters had to become expert at detecting fraud, because paying gold for fake spices could mean both financial loss and medical consequences if soldiers relied on them for treatment. Picture yourself now, that crushed peppercorn still tingling on your tongue. The meat you're chewing tastes almost bearable, the sharpness cutting through the salt and the faint edge of spoilage. You know this tiny seed travelled further than you'll probably ever travel in your lifetime. It passed through hands in distant lands you can barely imagine, crossed seas and deserts, accumulated value at every exchange, all to end up here in your mouth, making this miserable meal slightly less miserable. That's the strange magic of medieval military spices, luxury and medicine, and survival all compressed into something smaller than your fingernail. You've finished your evening meal, pottage and dark bread washed down with ale, and now you're watching the officers' section of camp with a mixture of envy and resignation. Because while you're settling in for the night with your stomach adequately filled, but hardly satisfied, the knights and nobles are passing around something you can only dream about: wine. Real wine, transported in barrels or leather bottles, poured into cups with something approaching ceremony. And in that moment, the difference between their world and yours becomes as clear as the liquid in their goblets. Let's start with the basic economics. Wine was expensive, vastly more expensive than ale. A barrel of decent wine cost roughly 10 to 20 times what a barrel of ale cost. And that's before you factor in transportation difficulties. Wine was heavier than ale for the same volume, more fragile in terms of spoilage, and far more likely to be stolen because of its value. For an army to carry wine meant dedicating precious wagon space and guard resources to a luxury item that provided no nutritional advantages over ale. So why bother? Because in medieval military culture, wine wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of rank, a tool of diplomacy, and a connection to the classical world that educated nobles revered. The wine itself came from established regions: Bordeaux Burgundy, the Rhine Valley, Italian vineyards, Spanish coastal areas. Military contracts would specify wine purchases months in advance of campaigns. A nobleman planning to join a crusade might arrange for wine shipments to meet him at various ports along his route. Kings and princes travelling with armies would have dedicated wine supplies, sometimes numbering in the hundreds of barrels, each one carefully sealed and marked with the owner's insignia. This wasn't casual consumption. This was logistics on par with moving siege equipment. Transportation was a nightmare. Wine in barrels had to be kept relatively stable, or it would turn to vinegar. The constant jostling of wagon travel worked against this. Some barrels were specially constructed with extra padding and reinforcement. Others were transported on ships when possible, as water travel was smoother than roads. There are accounts of wine shipments being lost when supply trains forded rivers, barrels breaking free and floating downstream, while soldiers watched their officers' luxury rations disappear into the current. The psychological impact of losing wine while keeping salted fish apparently caused near mutinies more than once. Now, the wine medieval soldiers drank wasn't what you'd recognise from a modern bottle. It was younger, less refined, often cloudier, with higher acidity and more variable quality. Wine was consumed within a year or two of production. Typically, the concept of aged wine as superior was understood, but not universally practiced. Some wine was deliberately rough and harsh, meant to be diluted with water before drinking, following the ancient Roman tradition. Other wine was sweeter, sometimes fortified with honey, or spiced, creating drinks that were half wine, half medicine. Here's where it gets interesting: militarily, wine as medical supply. Medieval physicians considered wine essential for treating wounds and illness. Clean wine had antiseptic properties. We now know this is due to alcohol and acidity killing bacteria, but medieval doctors believed it worked through humoral balancing. Wounds would be washed with wine before bandaging. Soldiers with fever would receive wine mixed with herbs. Men suffering from dysentery, that eternal military plague, would be given wine to drink, often mixed with strange ingredients like ground eggshells or powdered gemstones, following recipes that mixed genuine medical insight with complete nonsense. The social rituals around wine consumption were elaborate, even on campaign. Officers would gather in the evenings for what amounted to formal drinking sessions. The wine would be poured by servants or squires, never by the drinkers themselves, that would be beneath dignity. Toasts would be made formal, and increasingly less coherent as the evening progressed. Stories would be told, strategies discussed, complaints aired. These wine-drinking sessions were where the real business of command happened, where alliances within the army were forged and disputes settled. A knight excluded from these gatherings was effectively excluded from power, regardless of his official rank. Common soldiers sometimes received wine rations, but only under specific circumstances. Before major battles, commanders would sometimes distribute wine to troops. Liquid courage had a long and documented history. The night before Agincourt, there are accounts of wine being shared more broadly than usual, though whether this was generosity or calculation to steady nerves remains debated. After victories, wine might flow more freely as celebration. During sieges, when ale supplies ran low, wine might be diluted and distributed as a substitute. But these were exceptions. The daily ration for common soldiers remained ale, while officers drank wine, and that distinction was carefully maintained. Some armies contracted with local wine producers as they marched through wine-growing regions. A commander entering Burgundy might negotiate with monasteries and estates for wine supplies, paying in coin or promissory notes, or sometimes just implied threats. Monasteries were particularly important because they often produced the highest quality wine and had storage facilities that could supply large quantities. There are wonderful accounts of monks negotiating with military quartermasters, both sides performing elaborate dances of politeness, while fundamentally engaging in coerced sales. The difference between ale and wine went beyond cost and status. It represented different cultural identities. Ale was northern Germanic, the drink of foggy forests and cold halls. Wine was southern Mediterranean, the drink of sun-drenched vineyards and classical civilization. A French or Italian nobleman drinking wine on campaign was asserting his connection to Rome, to sophistication, to the civilized world. An English knight drinking imported French wine was making a statement about his education and refinement. These weren't just beverages, they were identity markers in liquid form, and yet historians still argue about actual consumption patterns. How much wine did officers really drink daily? Sources vary wildly. Some accounts suggest a bottle per person per day, which seems excessive until you remember that wine was weaker than modern wine and was often diluted. Other records show much more modest consumption, with wine reserved for special occasions even among nobles. The truth probably varied enormously based on supply wealth and personal preference. Some commanders were notorious drunks who consumed vast quantities, others were abstemious and rationed carefully. There's also the question of spoilage and vinegar. Wine that went bad didn't just disappear, it transformed into vinegar which was actually useful. Vinegar could preserve food, treat wounds, clean equipment, and make questionable water more drinkable by killing some pathogens. So spoiled wine wasn't a total loss, just a downgrade from luxury to utility. Some armies travelled with deliberate vinegar supplies, having given up on keeping wine fresh and just accepting the transformation. Picture the evening scene now. You're sitting with your companions, wooden cups of ale in hand, and across the camp you can see the officers gathered around their fire. Candlelight glints off metal cups. You can hear their laughter, see the servant moving between them with a wine bottle. It's not that your ale is bad, it's fine, it does its job, but watching them drink wine reminds you that this army contains multiple worlds occupying the same space. They're fighting the same war, camping in the same mud, but living fundamentally different experiences, and nothing makes that clearer than what fills their cups versus what fills yours. You've been marching through enemy territory for 2 weeks now, and the supply wagons are 3 days late. The quartermaster is nervous, though he's trying to hide it. The provisions you carefully packed are running low. The livestock has dwindled to almost nothing, and then the scouts return with news that changes everything. There's a village 5 miles ahead, and according to local informants, it has full granaries. Your commander calls the officers together, and within an hour the order comes down. You're going foraging, which is the polite military term for what's about to happen. The honest term would be plundering. Let's be absolutely clear about what foraging meant in medieval warfare. It was organised theft backed by military force. Armies didn't politely ask permission to take food from occupied territories. They took what they needed, and the difference between requisitioning and raiding was mostly a matter of paperwork and how much violence was involved. Commanders would issue licenses to forage, essentially giving legal cover to soldiers to seize food, livestock and supplies from the civilian population. These licenses theoretically came with restrictions: don't burn, churches don't kill without cause, pay for what you take, but enforcement was spotty at best and non-existent at worst. The mechanics worked like this. A foraging party would be organised, usually 50 to 200 men led by a knight or experienced sergeant. You'd ride out from the main army heading toward a village or farming estate that scouts had identified as having supplies. The goal was speed and efficiency. Get in, take everything useful. Get out before local defenders could organise or enemy forces could respond. You'd hit the granaries first, loading grain into carts or onto pack animals. Then the livestock: cattle, sheep, pigs, chickens, anything that could walk or be carried. Then vegetables from gardens and root cellars, preserved foods, honey, wine tools, sometimes even furniture if it could be used for firewood. The villagers' perspective on this was unsurprisingly terror and desperation. These were often poor communities living close to subsistence levels, and having an army strip their supplies meant facing starvation themselves. They'd beg, plead sometimes, offer what little they had voluntarily in hopes you'd take less than if you just seized everything. Some villagers hid food in forests or buried it in fields, gambling that they could recover it later. Others fled entirely, abandoning their homes when they heard armies were approaching. The chronicles are full of references to deserted villages and empty countryside, testimony to the devastation that military foraging inflicted on civilian populations. Now here's where the moral complexity enters. Armies couldn't survive without this system. There was literally no way to transport enough food for months-long campaigns through territories that had poor roads and hostile populations. Foraging wasn't a supplement to proper supply lines, it was the supply line for large portions of medieval warfare. Commanders who tried to avoid it who attempted to keep their armies fed entirely through purchased or transported supplies, either bankrupted themselves or watched their armies starve. The system was brutal, but within the logic of medieval warfare it was also necessary. Some armies developed sophisticated foraging strategies that went beyond simple raiding. The English chevauchée was a formalized scorched earth tactic, where forces would sweep through enemy territory in organized columns, systematically stripping every village and farm of resources. The goal wasn't just to feed the army, it was to deny resources to the enemy and terrorize the population into submission. These campaigns would cover dozens of miles, leaving devastation in their wake. French chronicles describe English chevauchée with language usually reserved for natural disasters. The land was wasted. Populations fled like leaves before wind. Entire regions rendered uninhabitable. The French responded with their own tactics, including a strategy called living off the land that was even more aggressive. Rather than maintaining supply lines at all armies, would plan their routes specifically to pass through wealthy agricultural regions, timing campaigns to coincide with harvest seasons when granaries would be full. It was warfare by planned famine. You ate the enemy's food while denying it to them, creating dual advantage. Scholars still debate whether this was brilliant logistics or war crimes, and the honest answer is probably both simultaneously. There were occasional attempts at regulation. Some commanders forbade violence against civilians during foraging, threatening severe punishment for rape, murder, or unnecessary destruction. Others established payment systems theoretically compensating villagers for seized goods, though the payment was often promissory notes that would never be honoured, or coins whose value was questionable. A few truly disciplined armies, rare exceptions, managed to forage without excessive brutality, maintaining enough goodwill that locals would actually sell them supplies rather than hiding everything. But let's talk about the darker reality foraging as cover for atrocity. When you give soldiers license to take what they want from civilians, you're creating conditions for abuse. Soldiers would steal beyond what they needed. They'd destroy what they couldn't carry, burning crops and killing livestock. They couldn't herd, following the logic that if we can't use it, neither can you. Violence escalated. Villagers who resisted were beaten or killed. Women were assaulted. Homes were burned, sometimes accidentally in the chaos, sometimes deliberately as punishment or entertainment. The line between military necessity and criminal behaviour dissolved completely. Chronicles document specific incidents that haunt you when you read them carefully. A village in northern France stripped of food, the population left to starve through winter, children dying by the dozens. An Italian town that tried to hide its grain stores discovered, and subsequently burned entirely as punishment. English soldiers in Scotland killing farmers' families not for resistance, but simply because they were there and violence had become normalised. These weren't aberrations, they were predictable outcomes of a system that weaponized hunger and gave armed men power over helpless civilians. The psychological toll on soldiers who participated is rarely discussed, but was probably significant. You're a knight who's been trained in chivalric codes about protecting the weak, and now you're taking food from starving peasants at sword point. You're a common soldier from a farming village yourself, and you're burning grain that reminds you of your family's fields back home. Some men hardened themselves, convinced themselves the enemy deserved suffering. Others drank heavily to numb the guilt. A few deserted rather than participate, though desertion usually meant death if you were caught. And here's something scholars still argue about intensely: the long-term economic impact of military foraging. Some historians argue that regions subjected to repeated military plundering never fully recovered, that the devastation set back agricultural development by generations. Others point out that medieval agriculture was resilient, that populations bounced back relatively quickly once armies moved on. evidence exists for both positions. Certain regions, parts of France, during the 100 Years' War, portions of Germany, during various conflicts show demographic collapse that lasted decades. Other areas seem to have recovered within years. Picture yourself now riding back to camp with your foraging party. The carts are full of grain. You're herding a dozen cattle and maybe 20 sheep. There are vegetables, cheese-smoked meat, even some wine you found in a cellar. Behind you, the village is quiet, not destroyed exactly, but hollowed out. People watching from doorways with expressions you'll remember longer than you'd like. You've done your job. You've ensured your army eats tonight. And the cost was paid by people who had no choice in any of this, who woke up this morning in their homes and now face winter with empty storehouses. War's arithmetic written in stolen grain and desperate faces. You're camped outside a fortified town, and it's been 6 weeks since the siege began. 6 weeks of watching those walls, launching occasional attacks, waiting for the defenders to surrender. And now the food situation is getting desperate, not just for them, but for you. The supply wagons are arriving less frequently. The countryside has been stripped of everything edible within a 10-mile radius. Your stomach growls constantly, and you've started eyeing the horses with thoughts you'd rather not admit. Welcome to siege warfare, where starvation becomes both weapon and threat, where the question isn't whether people will go hungry, but which side starves first. Sieges were fundamentally battles of logistics disguised as military operations. The defenders had walls, fortifications, and presumably stored supplies. The attackers had mobility reinforcements and access to supply lines, at least in theory. But both sides were gambling with hunger, and the math was brutally simple. Whoever ran out of food first would lose, regardless of how many soldiers they had or how strong their walls were. Medieval commanders understood this completely, which is why siege preparations obsessed over food supplies even more than over siege engines and assault tactics. Let's start with the defenders' position, because in some ways they had it easier, at least initially. A town or castle preparing for siege would stockpile food for months in advance. Granaries would be filled to capacity. Every available storage space, cellars, towers, even churches would be packed with preserved foods. Salted meat, dried fish barrels of wine and ale cheese. Wheels, dried fruits, beans, peas, and most importantly, grain. The calculation was straightforward. How many people need to survive inside these walls for how many months, and how much food does that require? The problem was that calculations were always optimistic. Town councils would underestimate how long a siege might last. They'd overestimate their storage capacity. They'd fail to account for food spoilage rats in the granaries or soldiers consuming more than anticipated. And most devastatingly, they often couldn't predict how many refugees would flee into the town seeking protection. A castle stocked for a garrison of 200 men might suddenly have to feed 500 people. Soldiers, servants, refugees from surrounding villages, and the food supply that seemed adequate for 6 months now might last only 10 weeks. Rationing became the defenders' obsession. Town councils or castle castellans would establish strict daily rations, usually decreasing as the siege progressed. Early on, soldiers might receive nearly normal quantities, 1.5 pounds of bread, some meat ale. A month in rations would drop to half that. 2 months and people were surviving on thin soup and quarter rations of bread. 3 months and you're eating things you never imagined you'd eat. The hierarchy remained, though nobles and important soldiers ate better than common folk, even in starvation conditions. Some things never change even when everyone's dying. The psychological progression of siege starvation follows a predictable pattern that appears in chronicle after chronicle. First comes hunger, unpleasant but manageable, annoying discomfort you can still ignore. Then comes weakness, muscles beginning to waste energy, depleting simple tasks, becoming exhausting. Then comes the desperate creativity phase where people start consuming anything remotely edible. Leather from shoes and belts boiled until soft enough to chew. Horses starting with the weakest and working up. And yes, you'd eventually eat the war horses, those expensive trained animals worth small fortunes. Cats, dogs, rats, any animal that couldn't escape the besieged population's hunger. There are documented cases, and I want to emphasize these are extreme outliers, not typical of cannibalism during desperate sieges. The chroniclers write about it in horrified tones, usually third-hand accounts that may or may not be accurate. A siege in the Holy Land where defenders allegedly ate the dead. A castle in France where starvation supposedly drove people to unspeakable acts. Historians debate whether these accounts are factual or propaganda designed to horrify readers and justify military actions. The truth is probably that yes, in the most extreme cases when all other food was gone and death was certain, some people crossed that final boundary. But it was rare, exceptional, the absolute bottom of human desperation. More common was the slow death by starvation. Bodies shutting down, gradually immune systems failing, minor injuries becoming fatal because there wasn't enough nutrition for healing. Diseases sweeping through weakened populations, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, killing people whose healthy bodies might have survived but whose starved bodies had nothing left to fight with. Medieval chroniclers describe defenders who looked like walking skeletons, eyes, sunken skin hanging loose, barely able to stand much less fight. These descriptions appear so frequently in siege accounts that they're clearly based on repeated observation. But here's the twist: the attackers often suffered nearly as badly. Maintaining an army around a besieged position for months meant feeding thousands of soldiers in a location you'd deliberately chosen to be militarily advantageous, not agriculturally productive. The surrounding countryside got stripped bare within weeks. Supply lines stretched thin and became vulnerable to raids. Foraging parties had to range further and further, sometimes riding 20 or 30 miles, to find food, exposing themselves to ambush and getting killed for a few sacks of grain. There's a fascinating military calculation that commanders had to make: is maintaining this siege actually possible? Some sieges were abandoned not because the defenders held out heroically, but because the attacking army simply couldn't sustain itself. The besiegers would realize they were starving faster than the defenders and withdraw in frustration. Other times, relief forces would arrive specifically targeting the attackers' supply lines, knowing that cutting off food was more effective than fighting pitched battles. Medieval siege warfare was as much about logistics and mathematics as about courage and tactics. The endgame of sieges often came down to negotiations centered entirely on food. Defenders would send envoys asking for terms, and the key question was always, do you still have food, or are you bluffing? Attackers would spread rumors about the defenders' starvation, sometimes accurately, sometimes as psychological warfare. There are cases of defenders surrendering with granaries still half full, because they knew they couldn't hold out long enough for relief. Other times, defenders held on with literally days of food remaining, gambling that rescue would arrive, or the attackers would give up first. And when sieges ended with assault rather than surrender, the food situation affected combat directly. Starving defenders couldn't man walls effectively, couldn't fight off attacks, collapsed from exhaustion during battle. Attackers weakened by hunger couldn't press advantages, couldn't maintain sustained assaults, lost the energy needed for the brutal physical work of medieval combat. There are battle accounts where both sides were so malnourished that the fighting was pathetically weak, men barely able to swing weapons, the battle more like exhausted shoving between skeleton armies. Picture yourself now 6 weeks into this siege, sitting in camp and staring at your half ration of thin soup. You can see the town walls from here, and you wonder if the people inside are eating better or worse than you. You know some of your horses have already been slaughtered because there wasn't enough fodder. You know the supply convoy that was supposed to arrive yesterday still hasn't appeared. You know that if this continues another month you might be eating rats yourself. Noble birth and knightly training be damned. This is the reality of siege warfare, not glorious combat, but slow mutual starvation with walls in between. You're the quartermaster, or at least you're watching him work, because understanding his job means understanding why your army eats or doesn't eat. This isn't a glamorous position. There are no songs about quartermasters, no epic poems celebrating the man who calculated grain rations. But talk to any experienced commander, and they'll tell you the same thing: battles are won by logistics, and logistics means one man with an abacus, a ledger, and the weight of thousands of lives resting on his mathematics. Welcome to the obsessive, anxious world of medieval military food accounting, where every number matters and mistakes mean death. Let's start with the basic calculation that haunted every quartermaster's sleep pounds per man per day. A working soldier marching, training, occasionally fighting needed roughly 3,000 to 4,000 calories daily, just to maintain body weight and function. In medieval terms, that translated to approximately 3 to 4 pounds of food, depending on the density. Bread was the foundation. 1.5 pounds of bread provided maybe 100-200 calories. Add a pound of pottage, beans, peas, vegetables, that's another 400 to 600 calories. Half a pound of meat or fish, another 500 to 800 calories. Some cheese, dried fruit, or fat to round it out. The math was crude but functional. Now multiply that by your army size. 10,000 men means 30,000 to 40,000 pounds of food daily. That's 15 to 20 tons every single day. For a 3-month campaign, you're looking at 350 to 800 tons of food. And that's just to the soldiers. You also have horses which consume more than humans, camp followers, servants, craftsmen, and all the support personnel that keep an army functioning. The actual food requirement could easily double when you account for everyone. Transport becomes the limiting factor immediately. A standard medieval wagon pulled by oxen could carry maybe 500 to 2,000 pounds, and that's on good roads in decent weather. So feeding 10,000 men for one day required 15 to 20 wagons just for food. For a week you'd need over 100 wagons. For a month, 400 plus wagons, and those wagons needed drivers, guards, spare parts, replacement animals when oxen went lame or died. The supply train could become larger than the army itself, a slow-moving target that advertised your position to every enemy scout within 20 miles. Quartermasters had to account for spoilage, which added brutal complexity to the calculations. Bread lasted a few days before going mouldy unless you made hardtack, which lasted forever, but required different ingredients and baking processes. Fresh meat spoiled within a day in warm weather, hence the reliance on salted or smoked preservation. Ale began turning within a week or two. Vegetables rotted. Cheese developed mould. Grain attracted weevils and rats. A quartermaster couldn't just calculate how much food was needed. He had to calculate how much extra to account for inevitable losses to time, weather pests, and theft. Then there's the seasonal variation that made everything more complicated. Summer campaigns meant access to fresh forage wild foods and easier transport because roads were dry. But food spoiled faster in heat. Winter campaigns meant preserved foods lasted longer, but transportation became nightmarish through snow and mud, and there was nothing to forage. Spring was muddy and lean, the previous year's harvest was running low. The new harvest months away animals hadn't recovered from winter. Autumn was ideal, fresh harvest, good roads, mild temperatures, which is why many medieval campaigns deliberately launched in late summer or early fall. The quartermaster's tools were surprisingly sophisticated. Ledgers recorded every transaction, Grain purchased, livestock acquired, food distributed. Tallies tracked daily rations issued to each company. Inventory lists detailed what was in each wagon, what was in storage, what was expected from incoming supply convoys. There are surviving medieval quartermasters' accounts that are masterpieces of careful record-keeping, showing exactly how many pounds of cheese were issued to the third company of archers on a specific Tuesday in August 1346. The bureaucracy of feeding armies was extensive and detailed. Prices were another constant headache. A quartermaster had to know current market rates for grain, meat, fish ale, and every other staple. He had to negotiate with merchants, often under terrible conditions, trying to bargain for food, when the merchant knew you were desperate and had an army to feed meant paying inflated prices. Some quartermasters were authorized to simply requisition food at fixed prices, essentially forcing sales, but this required authority documentation and the threat of military force. Others had to compete in open markets, bidding against other buyers and hoping their funds lasted. Quality control was part of the job too. Merchants would try to pass off mouldy grain, watered ale, spoiled meat covered in salt to mask the smell. A quartermaster needed to inspect shipments, reject bad goods, maintain standards even when desperate for supplies. This made them unpopular with both merchants who resented the scrutiny and soldiers who blamed them when rations were short. It was a position that earned you enemies from every direction. And the pressure, imagine the weight of knowing that your calculations determine whether men live or die. Underestimate food needs and soldiers starve, morale collapses, the campaign fails. Overestimate and you waste resources, slow the army with unnecessary wagons, and might run out of money before the campaign ends. Get the timing wrong on a supply convoy and troops go hungry for days. Make an error in your ledger, and suddenly there's a shortage no one can explain. The margin for error was razor thin, and mistakes were visible to everyone. Some quartermasters developed sophisticated forecasting methods. They'd study previous campaigns, learning typical consumption rates. They'd account for weather patterns, expected combat intensity, likelihood of foraging success. The best ones were mathematical geniuses who could calculate complex supply chains in their heads, adjusting on the fly as circumstances changed. Others were barely competent political appointees who got the job through connections and struggled constantly, their incompetence measured in hungry soldiers. There's scholarly debate about how much autonomy quartermasters actually had. Some historians argue they were powerful figures who effectively controlled campaign strategy. If the quartermaster said the army couldn't be supplied, beyond a certain point the campaign stopped there. Others suggest they were simply administrators executing commanders' orders with little real authority. The truth probably varied. A strong, competent quartermaster could shape decisions through the power of logistical reality. A weak one would be overruled and blamed when things went wrong. And here's something that rarely appears in chronicles but must have been constant: the moral weight of rationing decisions. When food runs short, who eats and who goes hungry? Do you maintain equal rations for everyone and watch the whole army weaken gradually? Do you prioritize combat troops and let support personnel starve? Do you keep the nobles fed while common soldiers go hungry? Maintaining hierarchy even in scarcity. These weren't theoretical questions, they were daily decisions with life and death consequences, made by men whose names history barely remembers. Picture the quartermaster now late at night in his tent surrounded by ledgers and tally sticks. Candlelight flickers across columns of numbers. He's calculating tomorrow's rations, next week's supply needs, whether the grain shipment will arrive before the current supplies run out. His head aches, his eyes burn. Outside, thousands of men sleep, trusting that when they wake there will be food. He's the man who makes that happen, through mathematics and anxiety and obsessive attention to detail. No songs, no glory, just numbers that mean everything. You're waking up on a summer morning in June and already you can hear the camp stirring with unusual energy. There's foraging parties organising earlier than usual, soldiers talking excitedly about wild strawberries someone found near the stream, and the cook fires smell different, fresher, somehow less dominated by the eternal stench of salted meat. Because it's summer campaign season, and that means the landscape itself becomes part of your food supply in ways that winter could never offer. But flip the calendar 6 months forward, and you're huddled in a frozen camp, eating from dwindling stores while snow buries any hope of fresh food. Medieval military cuisine wasn't just about what you packed, it was profoundly shaped by which season you were trying to stay alive in. Let's start with summer, because that's when medieval armies actually wanted to campaign if they had any choice in the matter. Late spring through early autumn offered massive advantages for feeding troops. First, the obvious fresh food was available everywhere. Wild berries, strawberries, raspberries, blackberries ripened in hedgerows and forests. Soldiers could pick them by the handful during rest stops, supplementing their rations with something sweet and fresh. It wasn't much calorically, but psychologically it was enormous. Fresh fruit after weeks of preserved food tasted like a gift from God. Game was more abundant and easier to catch in summer. Deer had fawns, making them slower and more vulnerable. Birds were nesting, less mobile, simpler to trap. Rabbits and hares were everywhere, fattened on spring grass. Rivers teemed with fish. A skilled foraging party in summer could return with significant fresh protein, enough to feed a company for a day or supplement rations for a week. The hunting wasn't just practical, it was recreational, a break from the grinding tedium of military life. Nobles would organize hunts as entertainment, combining food acquisition with sport. Vegetables became available from raided gardens and fields. Peas and beans in their pods, fresh and tender. Leafy greens, cabbage, kale, lettuce that could be eaten raw or cooked quickly. Onions, leeks, garlic pulled straight from the earth. Root vegetables that hadn't been stored for months and gone half rotten. The nutritional impact was significant. Fresh vegetables provided vitamins and minerals that preserved foods lacked, helping prevent deficiency diseases. Soldiers eating fresh food in summer stayed healthier, recovered from minor illnesses, faster maintained better energy. The grazing was good for livestock, which meant the animals travelling with the army could feed themselves instead of consuming precious grain stores. Cattle and sheep could be turned out to pasture, while the army rested fattening up on summer grass. Horses too, though war horses still needed grain for energy, they could supplement with grazing, reducing the burden on supply wagons. This meant the livestock arrived at their eventual slaughter in better condition, providing more and better meat. But summer wasn't perfect. Heat created its own problems. Food spoiled faster, meat left out for even a few hours could become dangerous. Flies were a plague, contaminating food and spreading disease. Water sources could dry up or become stagnant, concentrating whatever contaminants they contained. Soldiers suffered from heat exhaustion, which increased water needs beyond what was easily available. The very abundance that made summer attractive also made it the season when armies moved through territories, quickly stripping them bare because everyone else, enemy armies, civilian populations, foraging animals, wanted the same resources. Autumn was harvest season, and armies deliberately timed campaigns to coincide with it. Ripe grain fields stretched across the countryside waiting to be seized. Granaries in villages and estates filled up ready for plunder. Fruit trees heavy with apples, pears, plums. Nut trees dropping their harvest. Wine grapes ready for pressing or just eating fresh. An army moving through agricultural territory in September or October could live extraordinarily well taking food that farmers had spent all year producing. This was calculated strategy time your invasion for harvest, and you'd feed your army while starving the enemy population in one efficient operation. The psychological impact of harvest season campaigns was brutal on the civilian population. Imagine spending months growing crops the entire year's food supply only to watch an army sweep through and take everything within a few days. Chronicles describe farmers watching helplessly as soldiers harvested their fields, loaded their grain onto wagons and moved on, leaving behind empty land and the certainty of winter starvation. This wasn't collateral damage, it was the point. Denying the enemy next year's food supply while feeding your own army was maximally efficient warfare. But then winter arrived, and everything changed. Foraging became nearly impossible. Wild foods disappeared. Berries were long gone. Game became scarce and hard to track through. Snowfish moved to deeper waters and couldn't be easily caught through ice. The landscape turned hostile, offering nothing but cold and danger. Armies either had to end their campaigns and return home or survive entirely on stored provisions and whatever food could be transported through terrible conditions. Winter campaigns were rare and desperate affairs. The Mongols sometimes campaigned in winter because frozen rivers became highways for their cavalry, but European armies generally avoided it. When it happened, usually because political necessity overrode common sense, the food situation became nightmarish. Supply wagons struggled through snow and mud. Oxen died from cold and overwork. Stored food supplies ran low just when you couldn't supplement them with foraging. Soldiers burned more calories trying to stay warm, meaning they needed more food exactly when food was scarcest. The preserved foods that sustained winter campaigns were the absolute bottom-tier hardtack that had been sitting in barrels for months, salted meat that was more salt than meat-dried peas and beans that took hours to cook properly. Fresh food was a memory. Even ale could freeze in barrels if temperatures dropped enough, creating the surreal problem of trying to thaw your daily ration before you could drink it. Chronicles describe soldiers breaking ice from streams to melt for cooking water, the cold so intense that men's breath froze on their beards. Spring was somehow worse, the hungry gap, when last year's harvest had mostly been consumed but this year's crops hadn't matured yet. Food was scarce everywhere, prices skyrocketed and armies found civilian populations with nothing left to steal because they were starving themselves. This was the season of desperation when soldiers tightened belts that were already cutting into malnourished flesh, when commanders counted the days until summer and prayed their men would hold together that long. There's interesting scholarly debate about whether seasonal variation in military cuisine actually affected campaign outcomes. Some historians argue that yes, absolutely summer campaigns succeeded, where winter campaigns failed primarily due to food availability. Others point to exceptional winter campaigns that somehow succeeded, suggesting that leadership and morale mattered more than season. The evidence supports both views partially. Season wasn't determinative, but it was hugely influential, stacking the deck heavily in favour of armies that could feed themselves. Picture yourself now in both scenarios. Summer, you're walking through a meadow during a rest halt, picking wild strawberries, sun warm on your face, the smell of flowers mixing with camp smoke. Your evening meal will include fresh-caught fish and peas from a raided garden. Life feels almost tolerable. Then winter, you're huddled in a frozen tent gnawing on hardtack that's been in storage since autumn, drinking ale that tastes faintly of ice, your breath visible in the air, knowing that tomorrow will be another day of eating from dwindling supplies while the cold slowly drains your strength. Same war, same army, different season, and the difference tastes like life versus mere survival. You're 3 weeks into a campaign and it's Friday. You wake up knowing something's different about today, not because of any military development, but because of a calendar. Because today is a meatless day mandated by the Catholic Church, and theoretically that applies even here, even now, even in the middle of a war. The Church says no meat on Fridays, no meat during Lent, no meat on various feast days and holy days that dot the calendar like spiritual landmines. And suddenly your military logistics collide head-on with your immortal soul, creating one of medieval warfare's strangest complications, trying to follow religious dietary laws while also trying not to starve. Let's establish the baseline first. Medieval Christianity was serious about fasting and dietary restrictions, in ways that modern believers often aren't. The prohibitions weren't suggestions, they were religious law enforced by threat of sin, and enforced socially through community pressure. Meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden on Fridays, Saturdays for some monastic orders, throughout Lent 40 days before Easter, on vigils before major feast days, and during various other periods that added up to roughly 1/3 of the year. If you were devout, or at least wanted to appear devout, you followed these rules. And if you were a knight or noble who'd taken religious vows, possibly even gone on crusade, ignoring them meant risking your soul. So how did armies handle this? The answer is inconsistently pragmatically and with a lot of theological gymnastics. Some commanders took the restrictions seriously and adjusted their supply chains accordingly. They'd stockpile extra fish for Fridays and Lent. They'd ensure bread could be baked without animal fat. They'd plan campaign schedules around religious calendars, avoiding launching major operations during Lent, when dietary restrictions were strictest. This wasn't just piety, it was morale management. Soldiers who felt they were violating religious law, while also risking their lives in combat, carried double burdens of fear. Fish became the Friday and Lent solution, which created its own logistical nightmares. Remember all that preserved fish we talked about earlier, the salted herring and dried cod. Significant portion existed specifically to meet religious dietary requirements. The demand for fish on Fridays created a massive market that merchants and fishermen exploited. Prices for preserved fish would spike on Fridays, and during Lent and military quartermasters had to pay premium rates or face the prospect of hungry soldiers who were also worried about damnation. But here's where it gets complicated. What counts as fish versus meat involved theological distinctions that seem bizarre today. Barnacle geese birds that medieval people believed spontaneously generated from barnacles rather than being born from eggs were sometimes classified as fish, and therefore acceptable during fasting periods. Beavers, because they lived in water and had scale tails, got classified as fish by some theological authorities. Puffins were fish. Whale was fish. The logic was elastic enough that if you wanted to eat something and could justify an aquatic connection, you might find a priest willing to agree. There's also the dispensation system, which was essentially the Church's acknowledgement that strict rules sometimes conflicted with reality. Popes and bishops could grant dispensations official permissions to violate dietary laws under specific circumstances. Soldiers on campaign might receive blanket dispensations, the logic being that military necessity and the difficulty of obtaining proper foods justified relaxing the rules. Crusaders especially received generous dispensations, the argument being that fighting for Christ's cause earned you some flexibility about what you ate while doing it. But dispensations weren't universal or automatic. They had to be requested, granted, and documented. Not every army bothered, not every soldier knew whether his particular situation qualified. And some deeply pious individuals refused dispensations even when offered choosing to follow the strict rules regardless of difficulty. Chronicles mention knights who would eat only bread and vegetables during Lent, despite being on campaign, accepting weakness and hunger as spiritual discipline. Whether this was admirable faith or foolish extremism depends on your perspective, and probably on whether you're the one going hungry. The practical impact on military operations is something historians debate. Did Friday fish requirements actually affect strategy? There's evidence both ways. Some campaigns show patterns of reduced activity on Fridays and during Lent, suggesting commanders adjusted operations to accommodate dietary restrictions. Other campaigns show no such pattern. Armies fought, marched and foraged regardless of the church calendar. The truth probably varied by army commander and how seriously the troops took their religious obligations. There's also class stratification in religious observance. Nobles and knights more educated and more concerned with their public reputations were more likely to follow dietary laws strictly. They could afford the preserved fish, could spare the calories needed to stay strong, while fasting could maintain the spiritual discipline expected of their class. Common soldiers less educated and more desperate might ignore the restrictions or follow them only loosely, prioritizing survival over salvation. The officers would eat fish on Friday while the foot soldiers ate whatever they could get and worried about their souls later. Some religious orders that participated in military campaigns, crusading orders like the Knights Templar or Knights Hospitaller, had elaborate rules about food. The Templars' rules specified exactly what they could eat when they could eat it, and how meals should be conducted. They maintained discipline even on campaign eating together, observing silence during meals following the liturgical calendar precisely. This wasn't just piety, it was identity. Being a Templar meant living by the rule, including its dietary requirements, and that discipline extended to warfare. Lent was the most challenging period. 40 days of restricted diet, often falling in late winter or early spring when supplies were already scarce. Armies would avoid launching campaigns during Lent if possible, or if already in the field would essentially maintain defensive positions until it ended. There are documented cases of armies negotiating temporary truces during Lent, both sides agreeing to pause hostilities until after Easter, using religious observance as diplomatic excuse for what was really just waiting for better weather and food availability. The psychological dimension fascinates me. Imagine you're a soldier who genuinely believes in sin, hell, and divine judgment. You're already terrified of dying in battle. That's baseline medieval military experience. Now, add the fear that eating meat on Friday might damn your soul eternally. Even if you receive dispensation, even if your priest says it's acceptable, there's that nagging doubt. What if they're wrong? What if God is recording every violation? The spiritual anxiety added another layer to the constant stress of campaign life. And here's something chroniclers mention occasionally: soldiers making deals with God about food, promising that if they survive the campaign they'll observe strict fasting for a year, vowing to make pilgrimages or donate to churches in exchange for divine forgiveness of dietary violations. These weren't casual promises, they were binding contracts with the Almighty, made by men who believed utterly in supernatural judgment. Food became entangled with salvation, every meal a potential sin or act of devotion. Picture Friday evening now. The camp has organised fish distribution, salted herring, tonight passed out to each company. Some men eat it gratefully, relieved they're observing the holy day. Others eat it resentfully, wishing for meat and muttering about rules that seem absurd in war zones. A few knights in their section eat only bread and vegetables, going beyond the minimum requirements, advertising their piety. And maybe somewhere a soldier who couldn't get fish, who ate salted pork because that's what was available, sits alone afterward wondering if he's damned if that piece of meat will be counted against him when his life is weighed. War and faith, hunger and salvation all tangled together in ways that would take theologians centuries to fully untangle. You've been on campaign for 5 weeks eating from the standard provisions when you notice something's wrong. Your gums are bleeding when you eat. Your legs ache in ways that feel different from normal march fatigue. A few men in your company have developed strange bruises that appeared without injury. One soldier's old wound, which had healed weeks ago, has reopened and won't stop seeping. And then someone dies not from battle, not from obvious illness, just a sudden collapse and failure to wake up. Welcome to the invisible battlefield of medieval military campaigns, the slow-motion disaster of nutritional deficiency food poisoning, and the 1,000 ways that bad food kills you more slowly than swords, but just as certainly. Let's start with spoilage, because that was the most immediate danger. Remember all that preserved food, the salted meat, the dried fish, the grain stores. None of it was perfectly preserved. Salt helped, drying helped. But medieval preservation was an imperfect science fighting a losing battle against bacteria, mold and time. Meat that had been salted months ago might look and smell acceptable, but be crawling with bacterial contamination. Fish that seemed fine could have started decomposing internally. Grain infested with weevils and fungal toxins still got ground into flour because throwing it away meant going hungry. The signs of bad meat were obvious. If you knew to look, slimminess off colours, smell that was wrong, even accounting for salt and age. But hungry soldiers weren't always discriminating, and camp lighting was terrible. You're eating by firelight or candlelight, and that piece of pork that looks questionable might just look that way because of the shadows. So you eat it anyway, and a few hours later your intestines start cramping. Within a day you're experiencing diarrhea so severe it's debilitating. Within 2 days, if you're unlucky, you're dying from dehydration because you can't keep any liquid down, and you can't stop losing it from the other end. Food poisoning killed enormous numbers of medieval soldiers. The chronicles mention it constantly, usually with euphemisms like the flux or camp fever. But we're talking about bacterial infections from Salmonella E, Coli staphylococcus, all the usual suspects that contaminate poorly handled food. Medieval people didn't understand germ theory, so they couldn't prevent contamination effectively. They knew that certain foods went bad and made you sick, but they didn't know why or how to reliably prevent it beyond basic preservation techniques. The treatment options were horrifying by modern standards. Medieval medicine would balance the humours by inducing more vomiting or diarrhea, making the problem worse while thinking they were helping. They'd administer herbal remedies, some of which actually worked: ginger for nausea, chamomile for stomach cramps, and some of which were useless or actively harmful. They'd restrict food intake, which made sense for acute poisoning but left soldiers even more malnourished. Most men just had to endure lying in their tents, losing fluids, hoping their bodies would fight off whatever was killing them. Dysentery deserves special mention because it was the great killer of medieval armies. The disease caused by bacteria or parasites in contaminated water or food created bloody diarrhea, severe cramping fever and progressive dehydration. It spread rapidly through camps where sanitation was minimal and everyone was sharing water sources. An army that encountered dysentery could lose hundreds or thousands of men within weeks, not from the disease directly killing everyone, but from leaving them too weak to march, fight, or even stand. Many campaigns failed, not from military defeat, but from dysentery, breaking the army's ability to function. Then there's scurvy, that nutritional deficiency disease caused by lack of vitamin C. Medieval people didn't know about vitamins, that understanding was centuries away, but they absolutely observed scurvy's effects. The bleeding gums, the loose teeth, the joint pain, the reopening of old wounds, the eventual death if untreated. Scurvy appeared in armies that relied too heavily on preserved foods without fresh vegetables or fruits. It was particularly devastating during winter campaigns or long sieges where fresh food became unavailable for months. Interestingly, some medieval armies accidentally prevented scurvy through practices they didn't understand. Drinking ale made from fresh malt provided some vitamin C. Eating wild garlic and other forage plants helped. Sailors who ate limes or drank fruit juices noticed fewer problems, though they didn't understand why. The knowledge was empirical and incomplete, but enough to keep some armies healthier than others. The English Navy eventually figured out citrus fruits prevented ship disease, but that knowledge didn't become systematic until centuries later. Other deficiency diseases appeared less dramatically but no less destructively. Lack of vitamin A caused night blindness. Soldiers who couldn't see well in darkness were useless for guard duty and vulnerable in nighttime combat. B vitamin deficiencies caused beriberi with symptoms including weakness, nerve damage and heart problems. Lack of vitamin D from spending all your time in armor and never exposing skin to sunlight contributed to bone weakness. Medieval armies were often walking disasters of malnutrition, masked by the fact that well-fed civilians weren't much healthier. Contaminated water was another constant threat. Rivers that served as water sources also served as latrines, waste dumps, and sometimes mass graves. Soldiers would drink from streams downstream of all this contamination and wonder why they got sick. Some learned to boil water or add wine vinegar to kill whatever was making people ill again, empirical knowledge without understanding the mechanism. Others just took their chances and hoped for the best, which often meant the worst. There's also the issue of allergic reactions and food sensitivities that medieval people didn't understand at all. A soldier with celiac disease eating endless bread would become progressively sicker without anyone knowing why. Someone with lactose intolerance consuming cheese would suffer digestive problems blamed on bad humours rather than the actual cause. These conditions existed then as now, but without modern diagnostic understanding, they were just mysterious illnesses that some people seemed prone to. Parasites deserve mention too. Undercooked meat could harbour tapeworms, which would then live in soldiers' intestines for months or years, consuming nutrients and causing gradual malnutrition. Poorly washed vegetables carried parasitic eggs. Water contained parasites that caused various diseases. A soldier could be eating adequate calories but still wasting away, because parasites were consuming the nutrition before his body could use it. Medieval medicine occasionally recognized this. There are records of treating worms, but the understanding was limited and treatments largely ineffective. The cumulative effect was that most soldiers on extended campaigns were sick to some degree, not necessarily acutely ill, though many were, but operating below full capacity due to mild food poisoning, nutritional deficiencies, parasitic infections, and general malnutrition. An army that looked formidable on paper might actually be full of men who were weak, anemic, vitamin deficient, and fighting intestinal problems, all hidden beneath armor and bravado, until combat revealed how compromised they really were. Commanders who understood this, and some did, tried to maintain food quality as much as possible. They'd rotate supplies using older stores first. They'd inspect food shipments and reject obviously spoiled goods. They'd encourage foraging for fresh foods to supplement preserved rations. They'd establish latrines away from water sources. These practices helped, but they fought against medieval sanitation limitations, microbiology they couldn't see, and the fundamental difficulty of keeping thousands of men fed without poisoning them. Picture yourself now weakened by weeks of inadequate nutrition, your body slowly failing in ways you don't understand. You ate the same food as everyone else, followed the same routines, did nothing wrong, yet here you are, gums bleeding, energy gone, wounds that won't heal. Around you, other men show similar symptoms. The doctors dose you with herbs and tell you about unbalanced humours. You wonder if you're dying, if this is how it ends, not gloriously in battle, but pathetically in your tent, killed by bad food and invisible enemies your body can't fight. This is medieval warfare's other battlefield, where spoiled meat and contaminated water wage their own campaigns against human survival. You're marching through hostile territory and suddenly something catches your eye. A cart by the side of the road, a makeshift stall, and the unmistakable smell of fresh-baked pastries. It's not part of the official supply train. It's not sanctioned by the quartermaster. It's a sutler, one of those civilian merchants who follow armies like opportunistic seagulls selling luxuries and comforts that the military supply system never provides. You have a few coins in your purse, not many but enough. The question is, do you spend them on a meat pie that might be your last taste of something that doesn't come from a barrel, or do you save them for the next town, the next opportunity, the uncertain future? Let's talk about sutlers, because they were a fascinating element of medieval military life that rarely gets the attention it deserves. These were civilian merchants, men and women both, who saw armies as mobile markets and followed them specifically to sell goods to soldiers. They weren't part of the army officially. They had no military rank, no formal protection, and technically could be expelled at any time if commanders decided they were problems. But they provided services the military couldn't or wouldn't, which meant commanders tolerated them, soldiers needed them, and they became a semi-permanent shadow economy, trailing every major campaign. What did sutlers sell? Start with food, obviously. Fresh bread baked in portable ovens they carried. Meat pies, savoury pastries filled with whatever meat was available, sealed in crusts that made them portable and relatively long-lasting. Cheese from local farms acquired through purchase or trade. Dried fruits and nuts, honey cakes, beer and ale beyond the official rations, often better quality than what the army provided. Wine for those who could afford it. These weren't necessities the army fed you adequately theoretically, but they were quality variety pleasure in a context where those things were rare. The pricing was predictably exploitative. Sutlers knew their customers were captive markets with limited options. A meat pie that would cost a penny in town might cost 3 or 4 pennies from a sutler following an army. Ale that was cheap in peacetime became expensive in war zones. The merchants weren't being evil necessarily, they faced costs and risks that justified premium pricing. They had to acquire goods in hostile territory, transport them, while keeping pace with an army operate without the protections of town markets or guild regulations. They could be robbed by enemy forces, their goods seized by soldiers who didn't want to pay, their entire operations destroyed if the army suffered defeat. But soldiers paid anyway because the alternative was monotony that could break your spirit as surely as combat could break your body. Eating the same salted pork and hardtack day after day, week after week, you'd eventually pay almost anything for fresh bread that didn't taste like wood. A meat pie became a luxury worth a day's wages. Cheese that actually had flavour, that hadn't been sitting in a barrel for months, justified spending money you probably should have saved. Sutlers sold more than food. They offered clothing repair, stitching torn tunics, patching worn boots, replacing buttons and buckles. They sold small tools and equipment that soldiers needed, but the army didn't issue better knives, whetstones, leather cord needles and thread. They provided personal items, soap for those who cared about washing combs, razors, mirrors for the vain dice, and playing cards for gambling, even books and religious items for the literate and pious. Some sutlers specialized in services rather than goods. Barbers who would cut hair and trim beards. Prostitutes who followed armies specifically to service soldiers' other needs, This was common documented and created its own complicated dynamics of commerce, exploitation, and survival. Healers who offered alternative medicine or just sympathetic listening, fortune tellers who'd predict your future for a few coins, entertainers, musicians, storytellers, performers who'd provide distraction from the grinding reality of campaign life. The relationship between sutlers and military authorities was always tense. Commanders recognized that sutlers provided morale benefits soldiers with access to small luxuries were happier, more likely to stay with the army rather than desert. But sutlers also represented problems. They could spread disease, having less incentive to maintain cleanliness than official supply operations. They complicated camp security, being civilians whose loyalties weren't clear and who might be spies. They could provoke fights when soldiers competed for their goods or disputed prices. And they drained money from soldiers' purses that commanders sometimes preferred stay there. Some armies tried to regulate sutlers, establishing rules about what could be sold at what prices and where they could operate within or near camp. They'd license certain merchants, collect fees or taxes, and expel unlicensed ones. Other armies took a more laissez-faire approach, letting sutlers operate freely and trusting market forces and soldier judgment to work things out. The enforcement was always inconsistent. A commander might crack down on sutlers one week and ignore them the next, depending on his mood, the army situation, and whether he personally wanted something from their stocks. There's also the gender dimension. While most military roles were male-dominated, sutlers included significant numbers of women. Camp followers is the term that appears in chronicles, sometimes referring specifically to prostitutes, but more broadly encompassing women who followed armies in various capacities, selling goods, cooking, washing clothes, nursing wounded, maintaining relationships with soldiers. These women occupied a strange status essential to army function, but not officially part of it, economically integrated but socially marginalized, visible in records but rarely named or individualized. The risks sutlers faced were substantial. They could be caught in combat. Accidentally, battles didn't always stay confined to neat zones, and civilians in the wrong place at the wrong time got killed. They could be targeted deliberately by enemy forces specifically to deny the army their services. Robbers and bandits saw them as attractive targets, knowing they carried valuable goods and had limited ability to defend themselves. And armies themselves sometimes turned on sutlers. Soldiers who couldn't or wouldn't pay might simply take what they wanted, justified by military might and the thin excuse that the sutlers' prices were unfair. Yet they persisted because the profit potential was enormous. A sutler who survived a campaign could return home with enough money to live comfortably for months or invest in larger business ventures. Some became wealthy, establishing operations that followed multiple armies, employing assistants, diversifying into different goods and services. It was entrepreneurship under the worst possible conditions. No legal protections, constant danger, customers who might kill you instead of paying. But for those who succeeded, the rewards justified the risks. Picture the scene now. You're standing at that cart looking at a meat pie that's steaming slightly in the cool air. The sutler, a middle-aged woman with shrewd eyes, quotes you a price that makes you wince. You could walk away, save your coins, eat the official rations that are free and adequate. But that pie smells like home, like normalcy, like a world where food is pleasure and not just fuel. You hand over the coins, take the pie, and bite into it while it's still warm. For just a moment, you're not a soldier in a war zone eating survival rations. You're a person enjoying good food, and that moment, brief as it is, feels worth every coin you paid for it. You finished your evening meal, such as it was, and now you're sitting by the fire with the 5 other men from your tent group. Someone's managed to scrounge an extra portion of stew from the cook, and rather than hoarding it, he's dividing it carefully into 6 equal shares using a knife to measure precisely. Another man produces a small loaf of bread he'd saved from this morning, breaks it ceremonially, passes the pieces around. This isn't about hunger anymore, you've all eaten your rations. This is about something else entirely, something that doesn't appear in supply ledgers or quartermaster accounts, but might be more important than either the way sharing food creates bonds that hold men together when everything else is trying to tear them apart. Let's talk about communal eating, because it was the social glue of medieval military life. Soldiers didn't eat in isolation, everyone protecting their own portions. They ate together in small groups that formed naturally based on tent assignments, company organization, or simply personal affinity. These eating groups, sometimes called messes in later military terminology, became the fundamental social unit of army life. You might not know everyone in your regiment, might barely recognize men from other companies, but you absolutely knew the 5 or 6 men you ate with every evening. They were your family for the duration of the campaign. The dynamics of these groups were complex and deeply human. There was the practical aspect. Cooking for 6 men was more efficient than 6 men cooking separately. You could take turns tending the fire, stirring the pot, gathering wood. One cauldron served everyone one fire, provided warmth for the entire group. Resources were pooled. If one man received extra rations through good fortune or favour, he'd share with the group, knowing that tomorrow he might be the one needing help. It was insurance against the randomness of military supply and the certainty of occasional shortfalls. But beyond practicality, there was ritual and meaning embedded in these shared meals. The act of breaking bread together, literally breaking it, dividing a single loaf among multiple people, carried spiritual and social weight that medieval people understood instinctively. It echoed the Eucharist, that central Christian ritual of shared consumption. When you ate from the same pot, drank from the same flask, you were creating brotherhood through consumption, binding yourselves together in ways that words couldn't achieve. The conversations that happened around these evening meals were where military culture was actually lived. Men would tell stories, exaggerated tales of past campaigns, boasts about their own courage, jokes at each other's expense that would be cruel from strangers but were affectionate from tent mates. They'd complain about officers, speculate about strategy, share rumours about enemy movements or impending battles. They'd discuss practical matters, who needed help repairing equipment, who was feeling ill, how to solve the 1,000 small problems of campaign life. And in these conversations rank often softened. Yes, a knight eating with his squire maintained certain hierarchies. The knight got the better portion, spoke with more authority, expected deference. But the act of eating together created a space where those hierarchies could relax slightly. A squire might make a joke at his knight's expense that would be unthinkable in formal settings. A knight might ask his squire's opinion and actually listen. These weren't egalitarian spaces, but they were more humane than the rigid stratification of official military structure. Food sharing also created obligation networks that extended beyond immediate eating groups. If you helped someone with extra food today, you could expect help from them later. Maybe food, maybe other assistance. These informal debts and credits formed a complex social economy that paralleled the official military hierarchy. A man who was generous with food gained reputation and influence. A man who hoarded while others went hungry lost respect and found himself isolated when he eventually needed help. There's also the protective function of communal eating. Eating alone made you vulnerable to theft of your food, to being excluded from information networks, to the psychological toll of isolation. Men who ate in groups watched each other's backs, literally and figuratively. They could identify when someone was getting sick before it became serious. They could intervene if someone was spiraling into despair or considering desertion. The evening meal became a daily check-in on everyone's physical and mental state. Some armies formalized these eating groups into military units. The Romans had done this centuries earlier with their contubernumate men who shared a tent and ate together. Medieval armies didn't always replicate that structure exactly, but the principle remained. Small groups that lived and ate together formed the building blocks of a larger military organization. Officers who understood this encouraged it, knowing that men who'd bonded over shared meals would fight harder to protect each other. The food itself, mediocre as it usually was, became elevated through the sharing. That eternal pottage of peas and onions tasted better when you were eating it with companions who'd marched beside you all day. The salted pork that was technically edible but barely appealing became more palatable when accompanied by conversation and laughter. Medieval people understood something. We've perhaps forgotten the social context of eating matters as much as the food itself, maybe more. There were also competitive elements to these communal meals. Groups would compare what they'd managed to acquire through foraging, trading, or luck. We caught a rabbit today became a point of pride, evidence of superior skills or divine favour. The quartermaster gave us extra cheese, suggested connections and status. These weren't petty competitions, exactly more like friendly rivalries that added interest to otherwise monotonous days and motivated groups to take care of themselves and each other. Scholars debate how much these communal eating practices actually affected military cohesion and effectiveness. Some argue that armies with strong mess traditions had better discipline and lower desertion rates. Men who'd bonded with their eating companions were less likely to abandon them. Others suggest the causation ran the other way. Effective armies created conditions where communal eating flourished rather than communal eating, creating effective armies. The truth is probably circular good eating practices supported cohesion, which supported better eating practices in a reinforcing cycle. And there's the poignant reality that these groups formed under threat. You ate with these men knowing that tomorrow or next week or next month some of them might be dead. The soldier across from you sharing his bread might not survive the next battle. This knowledge, never stated but always present, gave the meals an intensity and tenderness that peacetime dining never achieved. Each shared meal was potentially the last, which made the sharing matter more. Picture the scene in detail now: 6 men around a fire, darkness settling over the camp. The sounds of thousands of other soldiers eating their own meals, creating a low hum of humanity. Someone's telling a story that's probably not true, making everyone laugh. Someone else is methodically working through his portion, too tired for conversation. The pot sits in the centre, almost empty, a few bites remaining that no one takes because taking the last would be rude. The fire crackles, the stars appear. And for this 1 hour, these men aren't soldiers in an army. They're humans caring for each other in the only way they know how, by breaking bread together and pretending, just for a moment, that this strange, dangerous life is normal. You're exhausted from a day of marching, your body aching, your mind dulled by routine and fear. But before you can sleep, there's one more thing to do, something that sits between military obligation and spiritual necessity. Tomorrow you might face battle. Tomorrow you might die. And so tonight you eat what might be your last meal, and you do it with an awareness that transforms ordinary food into something almost sacred. The chaplain is moving through the camp blessing soldiers. Your companions are quieter than usual. Someone murmurs a prayer over the bread before breaking it. This isn't just dinner. This is communion with mortality, every bite taken in the shadow of the sword. Let's talk about these final meals because they occupied a unique space in medieval military culture. The night before battle, or sometimes the morning of soldiers, ate with death sitting at the table like an uninvited guest everyone could see, but no one acknowledged directly. The food itself wasn't usually special. Armies rarely had the resources or foresight to provide elaborate pre-battle feasts. You ate your standard rations, bread, pottage, maybe some meat, if supplies were adequate ale to wash it down. But the context transformed everything. This meal existed at the intersection of physical preparation and spiritual readiness, and medieval soldiers understood both dimensions instinctively. The physical preparation was straightforward. You needed calories for the brutal exertion of combat-swinging weapons, moving in armor, the sheer terror-driven adrenaline that burned energy faster than any normal activity. Commanders knew that hungry soldiers fought poorly, that empty stomachs meant weakened arms and slowed reactions. So pre-battle meals were substantial when possible portions slightly larger than normal. The rationing relaxed for this one occasion. Eat now, because you'll need the energy. Eat now because you might not get another chance. But you couldn't eat too much. A belly overfilled with food was a liability in combat. It made you sluggish, made the armor feel even heavier, and if you took a gut wound having eaten recently, made infection and death more likely. The balance was delicate enough food to sustain you through battle, not so much that it became a burden. Experienced soldiers knew this instinctively, eating deliberately and stopping before fullness. New soldiers sometimes made the mistake of gorging themselves and paid for it when combat began. The timing mattered enormously. Eat too early the night before a dawn battle, and you'd wake up hungry, the energy already burned through by nervous insomnia and pre-dawn preparations. Eat too late and your stomach would be full and uncomfortable when fighting began. The ideal was probably 2 to 3 hours before expected combat, enough time for initial digestion, but not so long that the calories were gone. But battles rarely happened on predictable schedules, so soldiers often had to guess eating when they could, and hoping the timing worked out. Then there was the spiritual dimension, which was at least as important as the physical. Medieval soldiers believed absolutely in divine judgment, heaven and hell, the immortal soul's fate determined by your state of grace at death. Dying in battle without proper spiritual preparation meant risking damnation. So the pre-battle meal became entangled with religious ritual in ways that seem strange to modern sensibilities, but were perfectly natural to medieval Christians facing mortality. Chaplains moved through camps blessing soldiers, hearing confessions, administering sacraments. Many soldiers took communion, the Eucharist, literally consuming the body and blood of Christ, or the bread and wine that represented them, depending on your theological interpretation. This wasn't optional for the devout. It was essential preparation for potential death. You wanted to die in a state of grace, sins confessed and absolved soul prepared for judgment. The physical meal and the spiritual communion often happened close together, both forms of consumption preparing different aspects of your being for what was coming. Some soldiers prayed over their food before eating, standard practice, but intensified by circumstances. Lord, bless this food and strengthen my arm. Protect me in battle. If I must die, receive my soul. The prayers were personal, desperate bargaining with God for survival, while simultaneously preparing for death. The food became part of that negotiation. You ate God's provision, acknowledged His sovereignty over your life, and hoped that act of faith would purchase His protection. There's also the communal aspect, which we touched on earlier, but reaches its peak before battle. You ate with your tent mates, your brothers in arms, the men who'd stand beside you when the killing started. The meal was farewell, and promise simultaneously farewell in case you didn't survive. Promise that you'd fight for each other, that your bonds extended beyond this world into whatever came next. Sometimes these meals were somber men eating in near silence, each lost in private prayers and fears. Other times they were deliberately cheerful men, joking and laughing, with forced enthusiasm, using humour to push back against terror. Alcohol consumption often increased before battles. though commanders had mixed feelings about this. Wine or ale dulled fear, steadied nerves, made sleep possible for anxious men. But it also dulled reactions and judgment, and soldiers who drunk too much fought poorly or not at all. Some commanders distributed extra alcohol deliberately as liquid courage, calculating that slightly impaired but willing soldiers were better than sober soldiers frozen by terror. Others restricted alcohol, knowing that battles were won by clear heads and steady hands. The balance, like everything else, was delicate and debatable. Historical accounts describe specific pre-battle meals with details that suggest their significance. Henry V at Agincourt supposedly ate simply bread and meat, and shared his meal with common soldiers, a gesture calculated to boost morale by showing royal willingness to share their fate. Whether this actually happened or is chronicler embellishment doesn't really matter. The fact that it was worth recording tells us that pre-battle meals carried symbolic weight that made them chronicler-worthy. There's also the stark reality that for some men this was literally their last meal. They'd eat breakfast, march to battle, and be dead by afternoon, their bodies cooling on some muddy field while their final food digested in stiffening corpses. Medieval soldiers understood this possibility intimately. The food took on an almost sacramental quality, not just nourishment, but a final earthly pleasure, a last taste of life before the void. Some men ate carefully, savouring each bite, trying to memorize the sensation. Others ate mechanically, too numb with fear to taste anything. And then there were the men who couldn't eat at all, whose fear had closed their throats and turned their stomachs, so that food became impossible. Commanders and comrades would encourage them. You need to eat, you'll need the strength. But sometimes fear was stronger than logic. These men would force down a few bites and stop accepting that they'd fight on empty stomachs because their bodies had already decided that survival mattered more than nourishment. Picture yourself now sitting with your tent mates for this final meal. The bread in your hand is coarse and dark, the same bread you've eaten for weeks, but tonight it tastes different, more real somehow, more present. The ale is warm and slightly sour, familiar and comforting. Around you men are eating with varying degrees of awareness, some treating it as just another meal, others clearly conscious of its potential finality. The chaplain's voice carries across the camp leading prayers. Your hand shakes slightly as you lift the cup. You're not sure if you're more afraid of dying or of being afraid. So you eat, you drink, you pray, and you wait for dawn to reveal whether this meal was farewell or just another dinner in a long campaign that continues beyond tomorrow. And now, as the fires burn lower and the camp settles into restless sleep, let's ease our way toward the end of tonight's journey together. These soldiers we've spent these hours with, their hunger and their hope, their resourcefulness and their suffering, they're settling into whatever rest they can find before whatever tomorrow brings. The last of the cooking fires fade to embers glowing soft against the darkness. Somewhere a man pulls his cloak tighter against the cold. Somewhere else another checks his provisions one more time, counting what remains, calculating what might be enough. We've walked through their world of salted meat and stolen grain of mobile ovens and foraged berries of hunger that was weapon and threat and constant companion. We've seen how armies fed themselves through ingenuity and brutality, through complex logistics and simple theft, through preservation techniques and desperate improvisation. We've understood that medieval warfare wasn't just about tactics and courage. It was about bread and ale, about keeping thousands of bodies functioning in conditions designed to break them. These men, knights and common soldiers, bakers and quartermasters, sutlers and cooks, they navigated a world where every meal was a small victory against entropy and starvation. They transformed military campaigns into travelling communities held together by the fundamental human need to eat, to share, to survive another day. Their stories aren't written in the great chronicles of battles and kings, but they're no less real for their absence from history books. They're written in supply ledgers and quartermaster accounts, in passing mentions of hunger, and feast in the small details that reveal how life was actually lived. The camp is quiet now. The stories have been told. The bread has been broken and shared. Tomorrow will bring whatever it brings, battle or march hunger or feast survival or its opposite. But for tonight, in this moment between day and darkness, there's just the sound of breathing, the warmth of banked fires, and the knowledge that somehow against all odds and obstacles these men found ways to feed themselves and each other in the middle of war's chaos. Let that image settle over you now, gentle as the darkness settling over those medieval camps. The struggle to eat, to survive, to maintain humanity in inhuman circumstances, it's universal across time, connecting us to those long-dead soldiers who face the same fundamental challenge we all face: how to nourish the body and spirit when the world seems designed to starve both. Rest easy now, knowing their stories a little better, understanding that hunger and its satisfaction are as much a part of war's story as any sword or siege. The story ends here. See you in the next video. Good night.